Hello everyone, I'm Tiffany Watt-Smith. I'm a lecturer in the School of English and Drama and a research fellow at the Centre for the History of Emotions, which is hosting this event today. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to speakers today, some of whom have travelled quite a long way to be here. It's such an interesting topic and I'm so looking forward to the discussion today. Before we start, I just wanted to briefly let you know a bit about the Centre for the History of Emotions. We were founded in 2007. The director is Thomas Dixon, who's not able to be here today. But the point of the centre was to bring together mainly researchers working in the humanities who were interested in trying to understand a bit more about how the way we think about emotions has changed over time, and particularly how different emotional states might have been understood differently in the past than how they are today. Now, today we're not talking about the past, of course, but one of the things that has been a very rich area for historians of emotion is thinking about the intersection between the sciences and medicine, sciences of mind on the one hand, and literature and music and other forms of cultural production on the other. And this is at the centre of what we're going to be talking about today. So, here we have people who I'm going to introduce properly in a moment, but at the cutting edge of scientific investigation into perception, into emotion, into the way we engage with moving bodies and so on, and also at the cutting edge of philosophical thinking about that. And Mervyn, of course, who's a puppeteer and a puppet director and a puppet maker, and looking at the interaction between those scientific and philosophical ways of approaching questions and these practical and creative and artistic ways is, I think, at the centre of what Mervyn has been doing. So Mervyn came to me about 18 months ago, I think, with this idea that he really wanted to investigate how it is that when we are looking at a puppet, which is so obviously, manifestly not real, not alive, we respond to that puppet as if it has got real emotions, if it has got real intention and consciousness. What is going on when we're doing that? And as I understand it from witnessing Mervyn go through the process of his Leverhulme fellowship, so the Leverhulme who have sponsored this event today also sponsored Mervyn to be an artist in residence at the centre for 9 months. And in the process of that work, as I understand it, your thinking has evolved and mushroomed, and many questions have emerged, probably more questions than answers, like the best kind of research. And so here today we're going to be talking about some of those questions and trying to interrogate them a little bit further. So Mervyn Millar is a puppet director and designer. He won an Arts Foundation fellowship in 2010. He's been working as a theatre director and a puppet maker for, I guess, around 20 years. He's directed many productions in theatres and opera houses across the world. He was part of the creative team for Warhorse, if any of you saw that, I'm sure you will have heard of it. And most recently, and I am personally very excited by this, has created a life-size African elephant which is currently in Vegas. So if anyone wants to ask him about that, I'm sure he will be very happy. Professor Emily Cross is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at Bangor University. She is interested in how we perceive movement in space, interested in dance, I think, in particular, and has been working at the moment on robots and how we perceive robots. So there's obviously quite an interesting intersection there. Professor Matthew Longo, or Matt, is a Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at the Bodylab in Birkbeck. He, in my notes here, says that he once donated dollars to a Vegas slot machine, so that's the important Vegas. He is a Professor of Cognitive Science and directs the Body Representation Lab. This is a lab with about 8 or 9 postdocs and students and so on working there. And he's interested in the spatial aspects of touch, how we represent and perceive bodies in pain and other kinds of somatosensory perceptions, so touch and other sensations. And again, I think it's quite clear that how we're going to think about what bodies, what puppets can experience in terms of being touched is something that Matt might be able to speak to. We have Dr. Susanne, go on, say it. Quadflieg, who is a senior lecturer in experimental psychology at Bristol. She's interested in how we perceive faces, how we make snap judgments and use forms of prejudice in the way we read people that we meet, and she's particularly been looking at the moment at advertising, and particularly advertising with social scenarios at the heart of them, so couples or groups of friends and so on. And finally, Dr Joel Smith. Joel is a senior lecturer in philosophy at Manchester. He has been working on quite a big project about how we recognise other people's emotions. I didn't get to ask Joel about Vegas. Have you been to Vegas? No. He's never been to Vegas. I also have never been to Vegas. Everyone else has been to Vegas. So if you take nothing else from this afternoon, I'm also delighted to say that we will actually have some real live actual puppetry happening. So I also want to say thank you to the puppeteers this afternoon, who Mervyn, I think, can introduce you. But before we get to that, I'd like to ask you each to talk briefly, 3 to 5 minutes, about your research, what you're interested in, and something that you took away from this intriguing conversation with Mervyn.
So I start?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay. Thank you. A lot of the writing and research on puppetry is about what the puppeteers do and what the writers do. And it tends to focus a lot on the metaphorical meaning of the puppet and the status of the puppet as opposed to an actor. Alongside my creative work in the field, I've always had a sort of interest in what the audience do. And in fact, the more I've worked, the more I've taught people to become puppeteers or worked rehearsing with puppeteers. It's become more and more apparent to me that the audience are being very active in constructing not just the meaning, but shaping how the performance exists. A few years ago, I did a TEDx talk about puppetry, and with quite a lot of speculation and not very much research, I talked confidently about how the brain was responding to puppetry, and it's always hung over me that I thought I should probably find out what was really going on.
Risky,
yeah.
But bold, I like it.
Thank you. And then a couple of years ago, a theatre maker called Russell Dean, who's literally just walked into the room. I was lucky enough that he asked me to help him work on a show that he was making for, with the help of the Leverhulme Trust, which was going to explain the concept of cognitive dissonance through puppetry, which was really interesting project to work on, and it allowed me to think a lot more about this question, and I wasn't quite happy with the answer. I felt like there were some other questions to ask that we hadn't been able to go into on that process, and then I found out that the possibility of doing an application for this sort of artist in residency grant, and was lucky enough with Tiffany's help to write an application that was good enough to get get the funding. So thanks to the Leverhulme Trust for that particularly. And it seemed to me that what I really wanted to ask was what's happening in the audience's brain when they're watching a puppet. And I wanted to ask that on the most sort of fundamental level, and starting from as first principles as we could. And I thought, okay, well, who do I need to ask? I need to find out what the difference between seeing a person and an object is. I need to understand what mechanism is at work when we think something's alive. What mechanism is at work when, what mechanism is at work when we see something? So as Tiffany correctly points out, as soon as you start asking questions, you find that there's another question before the question that you wanted to ask. So essentially what I've done with time is I've been going around finding the cleverest people I could and asking them. I managed to get someone to come here, which is great. So I've really just been going around and one-on-one saying, with your expertise, what do you think might be happening when we experience this phenomenon of enjoying and engaging with something that we know is not alive, as if it is? And you know, why do we think it's intelligent? What does it mean for us? And how might that change the way that we do puppetry? How might that change the way that we think about performance? And how might that change the way that we research, possibly as well? So that's where I started from, and I'm not sure I've got any conclusions yet. Fortunately, I'm not a professional proper researcher, so I don't need to kind of come to any conclusions. But for me, the outcomes for this that are largely this event, and to try and use some of these thoughts as a springboard to create new work in the artistic sphere. So that's where I've come from, and then I just went and bothered these people and others.
Thank you, that's brilliant. Emily.
Wow, that's very inspiring, very interesting background. So as Tiffany said, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, but I actually spent the more formative years of my life training to be a dancer. I thought this is what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I studied dance and theatre in LA. I actually came to London, studied abroad at the wonderful RADA Theatre Academies here, and thought that this is what I want to do. I'm on my way, I want to be a life on the stage. But then I started getting involved in psychological and neuroscience research at the same time, and had to make these difficult life decisions. And for better or worse, ultimately decided to take a path looking more at the human brain, human behavior, and how we perceive other people around us. I've always been interested in action perception. I think this comes from my background in dance, and really interested in how we learn other movements from watching people, how we learn movements from watching other people. And again, I think this comes from having to do this so much in prior life, and I still dance now, so still now how we can transform what we see in other people's bodies onto our own. But as I've gone through kind of looking at brain and behavioral foundations of looking at other people, what's been interesting me more and more is our questions of aesthetics. So how do we come to actually like what we see another person do up on stage? Or maybe it's just we're wanting to catch a train and we see another commuter really gracefully pick up their coffee that they're about to spill. There's all sorts of things. We're making aesthetic or emotional judgments in our lives all the time, and kind of how those really subtle but I think all permeating emotional responses impact how we see other people is something that's interested me more and more lately. As Tiffany also mentioned, I'm also looking at now, and there is a really clear thread, I think, somewhere to that, how all these things link up. I'm also interested in how we perceive other agents as being animate or not, and of course this is a really clear link to lots of Mervyn's work. And some work I've been doing over the past 5 years or so, we're asking these questions not just with objects or with human agents, but with artificial agents, in particular robots, and robots that sit right in front of you. Or perhaps virtually rendered avatars where we tell you certain things about them. So we're really interested in how, again, this point that Mervyn was making, what the audience, what the observer is bringing to a social perception, or perhaps even an interaction, how this is shaping how we see and behave with other agents. This is really, really interesting to me. And I could say lots more, but I think I'll wrap up there, or wrap up with the point about what most struck me about when Mervyn came to Wales on one rainy day in February, was it? Yeah, it was grim, it was great. But we had a wonderful chat with some other colleagues who also kind of work in the human neuroscience of seeing bodies in action. And what really struck me is there's this seminal finding from psychology from the 70s, and maybe even earlier, that some of you might be familiar with, which is the Heider and Simmel shapes. And these were, this was some really elegant work which showed, if you show people just kind of two-dimensional displays of triangles and squares and circles kind of moving around in space, that's all well and good. People see these as shapes moving in space, but if all of a sudden the triangle starts to chase the square, or starts to somehow look like it's interacting, people are instantaneously able to transmit some sort of intention or some sort of emotion or some sort of goal in these just very simple shapes. And when we were talking about like very simple or very sophisticated puppets, we kind of spoke about how the human brain, our quest, our thirst to see animacy in inanimate objects, this must really imbue the puppeteer with particular power of having over their audience with what you can do, because if we're so able and so willing to see really sophisticated social behaviors in two-dimensional shapes, you have a far more rich canvas with your puppets and lots to think about there.
Great, the power of the puppeteer, beware. Matt?
So most of my work, as Tiffany said, concerns spatial perception. I'm interested in spatial perception and vision, how we experience the space around our body, but also how we experience our body itself, how we produce a body image, how this affects the way we perceive the world, and how we experience sensations from our body, about touch, about the position of our limbs in space, about pain, etc. And I've also been very interested in illusions of the body. And I suspect that it was that line of my work that prompted Mervyn to contact me. And one theme in a lot of my work over the last few years has been that though it seems that we have very precise and immediate experience and knowledge of our body, nevertheless, even perfectly healthy people seem to show striking misperceptions about what their body is like. It's, of course, very well established in various clinical disorders that there are distortions in body perception. This is receiving a lot of attention in the context of eating disorders, for example. But the theme for my work is that actually even healthy people seem to have quite striking, or would intuitively seem quite striking, misperceptions about the size and shape of their body. One thing that Mervyn's visit to my lab prompted, which has been quite interesting, is the idea that Tiffany alluded to at the beginning, the idea that when we see a puppet, we can react to it in a way that it seems real to us, and we have emotional responses to it that are those you would expect from interacting with a real individual, at the same time that we know perfectly well that it's not a real person. And that distinction we had been aware of in the work we were doing in the context of illusions like the rubber hand illusion, for example, which is an illusion where if you set a prosthetic hand on the table in front of a person and you touch this rubber hand in temporal synchrony with touch delivered to the subject's own hand, they're getting a tactile experience that exactly matches this visual experience, both in the timing and in terms of where it is. And many people report the experience that this rubber hand actually is part of their body. There, of course, this quite similar distinction is in place. The subjects feel like this hand is part of their body. They know perfectly well it's not. They often start to laugh. They're perfectly aware of how ridiculous this situation seems. And the conversation we had with Mervyn about these sorts of issues when he presented in my lab made me think that actually this isn't just an idiosyncrasy, this two ways of thinking about it, about any sensory experience, for that matter, in terms of what we believe about it and what it immediately seems to us, is there in a lot of experiences where it's less salient and we don't think about it. In the case of a puppet, in the case of the rubber hand illusion, the dissociation is obvious and striking. But it's also there in a lot of situations that it hasn't received attention, and it's occurred to me that maybe it ought to. And we can see, for example, if you take a water glass and you put your finger behind it, if you look at it from the right angle, it can sort of look like your finger is about twice as wide as it actually is, quite a bit stubbier. And of course, you can say, yeah, okay, it looks like my finger's like that. I know perfectly well it's not. If you've been unfortunate enough to have dental anesthesia, it creates a subjective experience that your mouth is swollen about this size, but of course you know perfectly well that that's not the case. But even in situations where there's not a conflict, so if I look at my finger now, and I can sort of say, well, it looks like it has this particular size, it looks like it's about 1 centimeter wide, and that matches my belief. And so sort of think, well, there's nothing there, but there's still two attitudes I can take towards my experience, two ways I can interpret or think about the experience. And it occurs to me that maybe it's that match in our ordinary experience that is what demands an explanation more than the absence of a match in the case of puppetry, which is so much more striking and which leads us to think about distinction in the first place.
Well, to come back to that, it's intriguing. And Sunny?
So my background is in social psychology. I originally started out being interested in stereotyping, why we stereotype other people, and as I did this work during my PhD, I got more and more fascinated by first impressions. I prefer calling them rapid impressions because I think we can have very rapid impressions about people even after we know them very well. And the important thing for these impressions is that we rely on visual information only to make judgments about invisible attributes. So we look at people's facial expression, their morphology, their body posture, their way of movement, clothing, and we put all this together to suddenly judge their character, their emotional states, their current intentions and goals, things that are not directly visible, but for us it seems like they are. So we look at other people and we think we have access to their inner life, and like I said before, often we get it very wrong because we rely on certain social categories or stereotypes, prejudice, biases, that misdirect our judgments. The interesting thing is, in this line of research, is that many perceivers, when they look at a target, at a person, and we ask them to judge, they come to a similar judgment, what we call as a high consensus. But this consensus, nevertheless, can be wrong. And that is this interesting experience in society, that everyone agrees in these judgments and therefore believes in them and is confident in them. But just because another person believes the same thing that you do, that doesn't make it right. And there's a lot of evidence, for instance, that just because someone looks trustworthy, of course, there's not much evidence to pick up that they are more trustworthy than someone who doesn't. And so this is the line of research I came from, and in this process I was particularly interested in faces. I already mentioned the example of trustworthiness. There's a lot of research on trying to understand, even if faces are neutral, even if we're not showing an emotional expression, what are the impressions that people form when they look at these faces? And we know that personality traits are formed within 100 milliseconds, so it's really one glance as another person, and you get a gut feeling for whether you like them or don't like them, whether you think they're aggressive or not. So these judgments are really, really quick. And they are so important because your mind then starts to engage in searches that confirm your initial judgments. And so it's really hard to overcome these first impressions. And they can be really influential. So of course they influence things like dating. You just need to think of a Tinder app nowadays. All you see is a picture of a person and you decide left or right swipe, do I ever want to meet that person for coffee or not? Or more. There's a lot of evidence that even our voting decisions, things that are meant to be really informed by political programs and so on, are highly influenced by what the candidate looks like, and so on. And these are the questions I'm fascinated in. My most recent line of research, however, has come from perceiving as an individual or looking at an individual to seeing two people who are involved with each other, because I'm very much interested in this question. As you walk down the street, you very quickly decide, who belongs together, who is like a family or friends or lovers. And one thing you can notice in your own body is that you, for instance, would not usually walk between two people who are meant to be a unit in your head. Yeah? So you'd walk around them usually, not just walk in between two people who you think they're friends, even though they might not be talking right now. And that I find very fascinating, that we constantly make these quick judgments about how people belong together, and I want to understand how we do that and what type of judgments we make. So how can we judge whether people are friends or they just met, and do we judge dominance, or do we look at whether they have the same status, do we judge whether to which degree they like each other? And there's some idea, not that there are any data yet, but there's some idea that this was evolutionarily very relevant, because that would allow you to judge who has allies, who are their allies, can I still make allies with them? If I have a friend who has enemies, then probably they are my enemies. So we needed to understand the relationships between people. And there's one theory that is highly controversial, but nevertheless that has argued that our brain often developed along those lines of reading complex social relationships, and because it became very quickly very complex in big groups, we had to develop certain skills in doing that. And so yeah, the applied angle to my work is, as was mentioned before, that currently I'm very much interested how advertisers use our snap judgments about people, because they are brilliant. You see an ad that is 5, 6, 7 seconds long, and they induce certain social feelings because you see these groups of friends who are having this awesome time, and you immediately want to buy that drink or that, well, that's the idea. I don't know whether you want to buy it, but they're at least managing to induce that situation that you immediately know which feeling these people are meant to have in which type of situation they are. Yeah, I'm quite fascinated basically by how they try to manipulate us with these very quick impressions. And when I met Marvin, I think what I was most fascinated by is that when we look at people, we will always attribute a mind, and we always judge their inner life immediately. The assumption is other people have inner lives, and we want to understand them because we want to make the world a predictable place. And that's also why bias and stereotypes are so tempting to engage in, because it gives you the sense of control. You think you can predict what other people are like. And with the puppets, or even with the figures from Ida and Simmel we already talked about, I think because we understand other people usually quite well, or we think we do, we are always quite happy when we find something that seems to work like a human being. So I think we're quite easily tempted to perceive something as a human-like mind, because then we have the feeling like, oh, now I can understand what it likes or what it doesn't like, and how it feels. At the same time, I think what we talked about is this. So with humans, you know, you just immediately do that. I think with puppets, you have this interesting moment in the beginning where you need to meet the audience that is really skeptical, and I think you have this initial phase where you somehow need to convince them that they should go into this mode right now, and that they should be willing to perceive that thing on stage like a human intentional agent. And there something comes into play, what we would call bottom-up processing. So I think you need to give them certain visual cues that tempt them to perceive it as a human thing. We already, both Emily and Matthew touched on this, talked about that motion is a very important, and movement, human-like movement, and certain actions and so-called goal-directed actions. So the moment you see a triangle moving, it's not that where you see a mind, but when you see it moving towards something where it looks like it has a goal, it's chasing something, that's when you start to buy into the idea of a mind. And I was interested in this phase in the beginning, how you do that as a puppeteer, that you give these cues for people to go like, oh, yeah, actually, this is something that seems intentional.
Brilliant. Jill?
Hi, thank you. So I'm a philosopher. I'm not a scientist in any way. I don't do experiments. I don't have any data. I don't know anything about mechanisms very much, aside from what I read. I spend quite a lot of my time thinking about other people's experiments. So I work mostly in the philosophy of mind, and in particular on two things which are related, but one of them is more what we're here talking about today. So the first is self-consciousness and self-awareness. We have certain special ways of referring to ourselves in language, thinking about ourselves, and I'm interested in the extent to which those special ways of being aware of ourselves and coming to know our own features, our own psychological life, the extent to which those extend down into perceptual experience. The other thing that I work on primarily is our awareness of others, and as Tiffany mentioned in the introduction, I recently was involved in a 3-year project called Knowledge of Emotion. So the idea was to look at a lot of the sorts of things that have already been spoken about, the ways in which perception feeds our beliefs about other people's psychological lives, and in particular their emotions, but with a specific focus which is to do with the difference between belief and knowledge. So it's a familiar philosophical distinction between knowing something and really believing it. And it's a difficult question to answer about exactly what that difference is. And so the question I was particularly interested in in that project was thinking about what it is about our awareness of other people, and in particular through their stereotypical emotional expressions, that allows us to not only judge that they're in some emotional state, but to know that they're in some emotional state, because we do think that we can know what emotional states other people are in by observing them. Whereas when I say we typically do think, that's, in our ordinary lives, there is a well-known philosophical, skeptical view there that says actually we can never really know what's going on in another's mind, or we can never really know in particular what emotional state someone else is in. And one of the ideas that feeds into that is the thought which, until relatively recently, most philosophers have taken to be obvious. The thought being that when you see someone, when you otherwise perceive them, you don't see or perceptually experience their psychological states. What you see is something that falls short of their psychological states, a piece of behaviour. And then you need to somehow make an inference to the contents of their minds. So minds are a bit like theoretical entities. Postulate them on the basis of observable data, which is itself anything like a direct awareness of minds. And I'm interested in the question of whether that's the right way to think about it. So one of the things I'm interested in is an analogy between the way in which we come to know about the properties that ordinary objects have, like the chairs in the room, come to know that they're red. How do we come to know that they're red? Well, they look a certain way to us. And you make a judgment based on the way they look. So we have some sort of a recognitional capacity. We can recognize red things when we see them. But it's not so difficult to get yourself thinking, well, actually something very similar is happening with respect to emotional states. So there's a certain distinctive way that people look when they're happy, when they're sad, and so on, I think. And as long as we've got the right recognitional capacities, we can think of our judgments and knowledge of other people's emotional states in something like the same way that we think of our judgments about non-psychological features of the work. So that was what was going on in my project, and as a part of that I spoke to lots of people working on facial expressions and so on, and most of them told me that I was wrong about the nature of facial expressions, and that in actual fact, not everyone says this, there's lots of disagreement, but in actual fact, emotional expressions are massively context sensitive. So it's, whilst you might think that there's a distinctive way in which red things look, it's not the case that there's a distinctive way in which happy people look, or grieving people look, or whatever the emotion might be. Not only are there contextual effects on the production of emotional expressions, but contextual effects on our recognition of our dispositions to judge what emotional states someone else is in. So then my challenge was to see whether or not a broadly perceptual account of our emotional recognition can accommodate. I haven't worked it out yet. When I met Mervyn, we were talking about this sort of stuff, and in particular, obviously about puppets. And something that occurred to me then, which I'd sort of been thinking about a bit, but I hadn't really struck me with particular force, was that when you're perceiving a puppet, or in fact when you're aware of an actor who's playing a character, there are two things that you're aware of, and there are two things that you need to keep track of. Right? So if you think about the actor, there's the person, and their psychological life. But then there's the character that they're portraying, and the character that they're portraying has a different psychological life. There are different things true of the character than there are of the actor, and that's obviously the case with respect to puppets. There are different things true of the puppet than are true of the character being played. So Warhorse is a horse, but the puppet that plays Warhorse isn't a horse. And you need to keep track of these two things, and it can be very difficult thinking when you start thinking about a character's psychological life, working out what it is that is special to the character versus relevant primarily to the actor. So, for example, in a standard play, the characters don't see the audience. Right? The actor is facing the audience with their eyes open. So you need to be constantly distinguishing between the psychological lives of these two things, and that's sort of adds an extra complexity to it, and is part of the contextual aspect of interpreting others, right? Because it's all about the context in which you see these people, the reason why you don't attribute to the person standing in front of you the visual experience of seeing you looking at them is because you're sitting in a theatre.
Great. So, okay, so a great range of different perspectives and different disciplines here, which is very exciting. So, what we're going to do over the next, how much time we have left, is that we're going to divide the conversation into 3 phases. In the first phase, I want us to think about how do we recognise that things are alive? So that very sort of fundamental first question. The second one is more about emotions and the role that emotions have in this whole process. And the third one is what, which Joel's just been talking about, what is the role of context in all of this? Does it matter that we're in a theatre and that we know we are, and so on? And of course, sort of flesh out those questions. But in between each of these 3 phases, we are going to have a little introductory piece of puppetry to help get us focus our minds on this whole problem. So I'm going to
we thought there should be some puppetry here, otherwise.
Otherwise, it's a bit dry.
Wouldn't feel right. And so, 2 brilliant puppeteers, David Evington and David Ustani, are here. And they're going to do a bit of puppetry right now.
Oh, right.
So, we are in the worst position to see.
Yeah, should we meet?
Well, we can tuck in.
Still backlit now.
You're barely backlit, yeah. They're very short, the bits.
a drawer and a stick, 2 sticks, and a bit of plastic bubble wrap. So what's happening then? How are we recognising that those things, which I'm assuming everyone does, did have that experience where, initially like it's a stick and then suddenly you're like, oh, this is a stick and it's trying to do something and it's having conflict with other sticks and so on. Is it a sort of glitch? Is it a mistake in our perceptual system that allows us to recognise these things as alive, or what's happening? If you kick us off.
I would say definitely not. I think it's a very evolutionarily helpful thing to see. I think this idea that's come up in quite a few things we've been speaking of, this animacy. So they don't need to be human per se, but they need to be animate. And to see something that's animate out there, as Sunny said, we have predictions about other people. We have a lot of experience in our lifetimes of kind of forming these predictions and knowing what's going to happen. But with animate agents that aren't humans, it's really important to try to make these predictions, to try to figure out from what they're doing, like, do we have kind of priors that we can use to think, like, okay, that one's being aggressive because the other one, moves back when the one with the hammerhead moves forward, how to describe these characters. I think it's really, it makes a lot of sense that we have some hardwired predisposition to see some sort of social relationship there. And I think what's really interesting to me also is the actors, the puppeteers' gaze. Your gaze helps us infer that intentionality, because you are looking right at it. You're not looking at us, your eyes aren't closed, so this is really kind of helping the viewer to zero in on what it is that's going on.
Just to sort of tease out a bit more, why would that be an evolutionary advantage to be able to?
Because if something's rustling in the leaves, when you're going for a walk outside looking for your meal, your hunter-gatherer days, it really matters if that's just wind rustling those leaves, or if there's a snake under there that might be something that could cause you harm, or could otherwise, perhaps it's even a source of food. So I think movement is such a salient cue, and it's been something that has been evolutionarily very salient to us. But you guys might have other ideas about.
Well, I would expand on that, because this is an example of a more general issue. I think the point is that when you have one object that's responding contingently to what another one is doing in our ordinary environment, and certainly the environments in which our predecessors evolved, those things didn't happen with random objects. So this happens because there's a deliberate attempt made by the puppeteers, by the choreographer, to create this. And there's a very similar issue that comes up in perceptual psychology, and how do we understand what illusions mean, optical illusions. Does this mean that there's a glitch in the perceptual system? And I think the answer to that is no. It simply suggests that the perceptual system is making assumptions that are reasonable given the statistics of the reality of the environment we live in. But if there's, in this case, a devious psychologist who creates a stimulus specifically to take advantage, or to highlight, or to flout those assumptions, then you get these perceptual experiences. And I think what the puppeteers or the choreographer were doing is, in some sense, analogous to what an experimental psychologist does when they design a new perceptual illusion.
Yeah, I suppose the process of making theatre is kind of, in some senses, it's quite scientific in that we keep trying things until we find something that works. We don't always remember to write it up.
Sounds very much like
we don't always come to the same conclusions about what works, and I'm sure there are good reasons for that as well. But one of the things that became clear talking to people who work on motion recognition, emotion recognition, object recognition, form, body recognition, facial recognition, is that there are clearly some little systems that we're manipulating somehow. And I think some performers are technically expert in that, and some are intuitively expert, perhaps. Some people don't know how they're doing it, but they're completely watchable. And some people really know how they're manipulating the audience. But there's a lot of them, and it was really exciting to see when I was reading articles and talking to you that there's this idea of animacy as a percept. You know, it's not a construction of social behaviour, but there's something that lights up when you see those hydra and symbol shapes, or you go, that's red, and that thing wants something. That felt really useful from a performance point of view. This other question that was coming up already was the question of other bodies and our own body, and that when you know it's a body, I mean, these things aren't shaped like bodies, but
so how do we know it's a body?
Well, I think that's what I would have added. We talked a little bit about brain systems, and maybe we want to go a little bit more into details, because we know there are three important networks that get engaged when you look at other people. And one network is what we call a very low-level perceptual network, so it really is interested in the visual appearance of humans. It responds to human faces and the shape of human faces. We all have two eyes, over a nose, over a mouth, everything goes well, obviously, but that is the typical human face. And it is unlikely that when you watch something like this, that this region in your brain will activate, because there was nowhere a human face there. But there are other networks, one that we generally call the action observation network that Emily's work is very focused on, and another one that we call the mentalizing network that I often work with, that is involved in using these very basic visual cues and understanding what's going on. And there we bring a lot of knowledge from our own experience, so we can use visual information that is not exactly human, but we can start to treat it like a human. Nevertheless, for instance, when we watch this, I'm sure if we would now ask everyone what we saw, there will be less consensus, I think, than with real humans. So, for instance, the hammerhead stick for me, until the end wasn't sure where the front was and where with a human you wouldn't have that. You would know where the head is. So, so I'm not fully buying into the idea that with puppets we get to that level of mentalizing or intentionality attribution, as we call it, as we would do with humans. But what we get into is, I think, what Emily mentioned is that we have this need, we want to understand what's going on, we want to somehow use our prior knowledge to understand what's going on, and we're falling back on this if you see a motion pattern or a movement pattern where we think, oh yeah, that could be fear, or that could be chasing, or that could be curiosity, that is where we start to engage. But it's not that we suddenly think, oh yeah, now it looks human, or it has a human body. So because that, for all of us, you know, we have very clear expectations what a human being looks like. Because you just asked, you know, the stick, I don't think we will ever, no one will sit in a room and think like, oh yeah, that's a human now. But that is different, this perceptual judgment whether something is human or not is different from this animistic judgment, for instance, and from the idea whether it can have intentions and goals. And for instance, in everyday life, it happens often that with computers, we get annoyed and think they have intentions and goals, even though they don't look human. So we ascribe minds to things that are not human. And I think that is what puppetry can often play on. And the other thing I just wanted to mention is, I think most of us in the room talk about visual perception, how that is important, but I think what you saw here is that auditory perception is also playing a very important role, and I think watching the same thing without the sounds made would give us a very different impression. So I think that's another interesting observation, you know, how our senses come together to infer animacy. And the final thing that Matthew said, or you said it as well, that of course we are buying into the idea that some human minds are behind these sticks. So I think that is also different than if you would suddenly just see that little drawer and the stick standing up by themselves and doing something. Then I think we would not sit in this room and find that amusing, but then we would really be worried that something is wrong. And I think that is important to keep in mind, because if we see a puppet in a theater, of course we know someone has thought about this and is wanting to convey a message, and we are willing to try to understand that message, and that helps us to agree on maybe what's going on.
Just want to briefly ask, what since you said maybe no one would agree, what did people think they were seeing?
I think one of the things that occurs to me is and maybe on a more philosophical level, is the need that we have to create meaning out of everything.
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, just even on a really basic level, like what
there are sort of like archetypal narratives, aren't there, that we automatically project onto these things in order to create meaning for ourselves.
Yeah.
So even if we hadn't been able to see the actors, we would invoke a story because we need to make meaning out of it. We can't have it be meaningless.
Yes. And actually that whole question of meaning is something that we want to come back to, so how is that? But I actually meant on a really sort of simplistic level. I thought, for example, that I was looking at two snakes, roughly.
I perceive them as being dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs. Anyone else?
Curious sticks.
Curious sticks. It was definitely a bird, right? That was a bird, wasn't it? I mean, did anyone think that wasn't a bird?
I thought it was a butterfly.
Okay, butterfly. And what about the drawing? See, I think that draw was quite human. I mean, it definitely had a nose, that draw, to me.
I found the draw to be quite sinister.
Okay, sinister draw with a nose. Okay, anyone else?
I thought it was a eye, not a nose.
I thought it was an eye. Ah, okay. Ah, so you're right. Yeah, I was like, oh, that's definitely humanistic. Brilliant. Okay, thanks for that. Just wanted to check that point. So you know there's a puppeteer, you know it's a stick, and yet, you know, as you say, you know, you invest in this narrative about it. Are we doing, there's a very old-fashioned literary critical or literary historical term, suspending your disbelief. Is that what's happening? That's so old-fashioned that it doesn't even speak to what people think now.
I think that there's this. I don't think that what you do is start believing that the stick is a bird. Because if you start temporarily believing that the stick is a bird, then that's going to contradict with your other knowledge. No sticks are identical to birds. So you're going to have to, in terms of the beliefs that you have, the judgments that you're making all the time, like different people, thinking that stick was a different animal. I thought it was a bird, but I think you need to bring in the character-actor distinction. So you there was in the some of the other things that other people were saying, there was the likening of the experience of watching these things to visual illusions, right? So it's some object and it looks to be some way, but it's not actually that way. That's an illusion. And it's not entirely obvious to me that is what's going on. So, I mean, it might be, but certainly what's going on is that you're continuously making judgments about what the things are doing. You're interpreting them. But it seems to me what you're not doing is making judgments about the actor, or not primarily, it's about the stick or about the puppet, but primarily interpreting the character that's being played. So you're thinking about what the bird is doing, if it's feeling aggressive, if it's running away, and so on. And so it looks like it's somewhat different from some standard cases of where there's obviously an illusion, like something looks some way in which it's not. I mean, there's a way in which it looks, the stick looks a certain way, it's moving around and stuff, it's being manipulated, but that's nothing illusory there. So I think maybe you can say we suspend our disbelief, but in a sense I think that's slightly misleading, because we just form actual beliefs about, but they're just not about the stick. They're about something else, about the dinosaur or the bird, whatever it is.
So it sounds like you're all saying that what we're doing here is interpreting and reading almost a set of signals and cues, as opposed to believing in something, or I don't know, getting infected with some sort of a contagious emotion or something like that.
I think one of the points that Sunny mentioned previously is this idea of top-down versus bottom-up influences. So when we talk about top-down and bottom-up perceptual psychology, it's often bottom-up is what the actual percept is giving us. So the percept there are two hands, each holding a stick or a drawer, and some noises are being made. That's the percept, but very few of us are seeing that. seeing it that way because of this top-down process which is going on. So we're drawing on our experiences, on our knowledge of social interactions, on our knowledge of perhaps theater, all sorts of knowledge. This is the top-down element, and we're kind of retrofitting this scene with a narrative, and that's, I think, that's what makes it easier to read, that's what makes it interesting and engaging to us. So there's this tension between the actual visual input that's coming in through our eyes, going to our visual cortex, and it's in our brain, it's knocking around, but then the real rich stuff is kind of what we're putting on top of that. It's not what's actually coming in.
And just maybe on that note, I think what none of us has talked about, because maybe it's for none of us the main topic of research, but I just read a paper the other day which I found really interesting, is that in young children all over the world, so this seems to be a predisposed development, is they start with pretend play at some stage, right? And I can easily say to a 3-4-year-old, this isn't chair, this is our tent now, or we're going on a boat trip and I'm taking you on my lap and we're going on a boat trip. And we learn from early on to buy into this idea that we can pretend something's there that isn't there, but if you and I agree, then for that moment it's there. And I think that is also this distinction between that we really believe we are seeing something, or that we just know we are now in a shared reality where we're both buying into it. And I think that's a very different thing from really believing that this is now the new reality. It's just we momentarily agree on the reality. And I think that's the distinction that we have in puppetry, that people agree on trying to share a reality, but they're not really suddenly in this illusion where they can no longer tell it's a stick. They're just accepting on both sides that the stick is something else. And somehow it's scaffolded on this ability that little children have. So it's not something that we seem to need to learn. It seems to come developmentally, and I think that's quite fascinating. Why humans do that? Why are we willing to pretend that things are things that they are not?
That invitation to share a new reality is something that I think we can definitely talk about in that section about theatre, because I think that's a really important point, that contract that you make temporarily with an audience. Should we move on to talk more about?
I just wanted to ask, we'll follow up a little bit on both what Emily and Joe were saying, I think, to do with this top-down and bottom-up. One of the first things I noticed when I trained originally as a theatre director and started to work with puppets, sort of by accident, but one of the first things that I felt like I noticed was that the audience were watching it differently when the puppets came on. And I didn't know what I meant by that when I used to tell myself that, but then this is me trying to find out. But when I try and teach puppetry, especially to people who are experienced as actors, I quite often find that the puppet is making something more explicit that is also true of the performance when it's given by an actor, as kind of Joel's model is positing. And it seems, this seems like a good way of thinking about it, that there's the stuff that you give the audience, and there's the stuff that the audience is bringing to you. And as an actor or a performer of any kind, you're putting some stuff in front of people and hoping that their response is sympathetic to you. And I think the puppet helps to emphasise how shared that is somehow, how much is coming from the audience, and how it allows you to experiment with how provisional the information you put across is. So what if we don't use words and don't even have arms, but just move with using just the angle of the stick and the rhythm of the movement? And I suppose that's why these questions about what are these systems, what are the bottom-up systems that work? You know, if I paint a face on the stick but the face doesn't move, sometimes it doesn't work very well. So last week I was in a workshop where people are making some puppets. We're having a big discussion about, you know, how the eyes should be on certain puppets. Because if you get the eyes wrong, the puppet never comes alive. It's never looking in the right direction. It never feels like it's working. And so it's what we know from experience, I think, as puppeteers, is that trying to make it more realistic is not only not always the right way to go, but frequently unhelpful. And that's, in terms of the perception, from the perceptual side, that's really interesting to me I thought I would go and talk to some of the perceptual scientists and say, is there a problem with the fact that I'm only giving the audience some of the information of a character? Is it a problem that their legs don't move, or they haven't got the arms, for example? And most of the researchers said, no, we constantly interpret a full behaviour from partial cues. And so the brain doesn't seem to have a problem with assuming that that's probably a person or something. Is that, am I?
But it sounds like what you're saying is that it's almost better if there's less. It's better.
I suppose if we get the balance right, it might be, but we don't.
It's easier to get the audience to attend where you want them to attend if you have less.
Go on.
There are certain cues that communicate what it is you want to communicate about the mental state or the physical state or whatever about the character. And then if you add lots of incidental cues to increase the realism, there's a risk that someone's going to be focusing on those incidental cues and not the ones that are actually communicating what you feel is relevant. If you only have the relevant ones, then that risk is decreased.
Yeah.
This may dovetail nicely into questions about caricature and emotion and so on that you raised. So maybe this is a good moment to move on to thinking a bit about emotions in the next.
Do you want to see more puppets?
Oh, yeah, maybe.
Go on then.
Props up.
This isn't part of it.
library scene there. Freud reading. Anyway. So, yes, thanks for that. That was gorgeous. So, what role are emotions playing in the way that we engage with that whole scene and what we're doing in terms of interpreting those behaviours as intended and conscious, or if that's the right word, but also, where are emotions in that, what we're doing?
Well, it struck me that one of the interesting things about those puppets is that their faces don't move. So I mentioned, we think of being stereotypical emotional expressions, and we associate those with each of the emotions. And those are the stereotypes of facial expressions. And those, it was easy to tell that the one that was trying to read was irritated. But it's not because of the face he was pulling, right? So the face was exactly the same throughout. So it sort of highlights the role of, there seem to be two things, right? So one is the role of posture and just expressive movements, which aren't facial expressions, very important in attributing emotional states to other people. But also context, right? So the fact that the one who's reading a book was very important to us in seeing that one as being annoyed. And that's part of the context, right? We're not looking at anything on the face or the body, right? We're looking at the situation in which they're in. Because we all know that someone's making a lot of noise beside you when you're trying to read a book, library and so on, that's annoying. So we bring that to bear on the interpretation.
So there was a lot of movement in that scene as well, wasn't there? And as you're saying, that actually the emotions are being communicated through, this is something that I think we both could speak to. That's, where do the emotions sit within those movements?
I think we're talking about emotions, there are two things interesting here, and one thing that maybe just underlines your point. So there's a really nice study I just want to mention where they took facial expressions of people who had either just lost or won a tennis match at a very prominent tournament, so people who were professional tennis players. And if you would just show participants the faces and they had to say, do you think they just won or lost? They were at 50%, so they were guessing a chance. But if you would show them the faces on the body, they were better than chance at suddenly saying, oh, they just won or they just lost. So the face was often considered very prominent, but the more we understand in this research, the more we attach faces to bodies, we realize how we understand the faces is very much driven by the body. And this is why you can have puppets that have no facial expression, but just through the motion and the postures and so on, you can express quite a lot of emotions. But again, as Emily said, or as you guys said, each of us had the experience of being in a library and knowing that the one non-verbal signal that is left is to give these stares in the beginning, to try to tell someone, look, try to be less loud. And I mean, that's a signal that worked with these puppets very well. So again, if they wouldn't have eyes, for instance, or if they would have just been sticks, maybe we wouldn't have gotten the narrative so easily. So the one non-verbal cue that is important was actually there. It wasn't the expression, but it was definitely eye gaze and motion. And the other thing, when you talk about emotion, I think, I don't know how the rest felt, but for me, watching this was more satisfying than the first thing. So I'm not talking about the emotion as a perceiver, as an observer, because here I felt like I do understand more easily what's going on, and I know where this is going. This is the first one I was left a bit frustrated because I wasn't sure whether the narrative I'm building is actually what's going on. And at first you think this one stick is the bully, but then you don't know, maybe now the drawer is the bully, and you're like, ooh, wow, what's going on? And I think that was another thing I talked about with Mervyn a little bit. Is it good when you are as a viewer in the suspense that you don't fully know what's going on? So, or can it get to a level where you're too frustrated? And I personally know that I'm probably a bit narrow-minded in German, because I can get frustrated with things where I'm like, they're too experimental for me. If I don't understand exactly what's going on, I sometimes disengage, and I think that's another interesting thing as a puppeteer. You know, where's this point where you get someone enough excited that they have the emotion that they want to understand what's going on, but not so frustrated that they are like, oh,
It's a
too
bit, I
complex.
bet you have fun going to the theatre in Berlin.
For
That must be really satisfying. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that there are all these other emotions going on when you're, I mean, I was thinking about sentimentality and nostalgia as well, but also you brought up predictability earlier on, and someone else did as well, that sort of satisfaction of knowing what's going on is a good feeling in its own right. But this business of caricature that you brought up earlier on, and sort of the way we might simplify a movement. I mean, in real life, that kind of aggressive gesture that one of the puppets did to the other, like, you know, are you really looking at me and telling me to shut up? You know, probably that's not really going to happen in real life quite in that explicit, extreme sort of way. But that's what you need for it to read there, don't you? So, I suppose what I'm wondering is what would happen if we had a sort of richer, more complex emotional thing going on in front of us with the puppets? Would it still work?
Well, looks as if you're looking at you, I don't know what.
I mean, there were some caricatured emotional displays in there, but some of the emotions that were displayed that were very effective and very easy for us as an audience to understand weren't like that at all. So I'm not sure there's anything special. And you know, I take, for example, just when the one puppet would just kind of glance over immediately following one of the coughs, we had no difficulty interpreting that as irritation. And it's sort of interesting in relation to Joel's comments earlier on about whether or not there would be a one-to-one correspondence between a certain type of facial display and a certain type of emotional expression. Because if that same glance over happened without there having been a cough or something, we would interpret it in a very different way. It might be a flirty glance over or something. But because of the context in which it occurs, we interpret it in a very different way. And that suggests that it's not really anything intrinsic to that movement.
I mean,
so I've avoided your question rather than answering about it.
yeah. Well, you did answer it, you said no. And I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think my contention would be if it's clear and if the situation is clear, there's no emotion so subtle that you can't read it in the puppet. But when I, just on the subject of emotions in general, when I started this project, I was coming here to the Centre for the History of Emotions, and I thought, I don't really know if I'm looking at emotions actually. I'm looking at kind of emotion perception and, you know, a really abstract kind of purist things. And the more work I did, the more central emotions became to my understanding of what we were doing, both as perceivers and as performers, because it felt like what Sanna's starting to pick up on about how we read other people's bodies is not sometimes very explicit in terms of, it feels like, and this might be something to do with action observation and mirroring networks, but it felt, because emotions are responsive, because they're pre-conscious, because they're inherently physical as well as mental, it felt like these are the things that people are recognising in the puppet, and that it's so much less about choreography and creating a movement that is designed to stimulate an audience member, and much more like trying to capture the feeling of an emotional response to something, because you're always in a dynamic situation on stage, and trying to see how much of that you can communicate with this tool. To the audience. That's a bit jumbled, but
no, I think that makes a lot of sense. He's picking up on two of those points. One, I think emotion recognition it's almost like a shortcut. So when you see emotions there, as Sunny was saying, you have an into what it is that's going on. So it's like, okay, I'm at ease as a spectator because I can see irritation and I know what I would do in that situation. But you know, if there's kind of really beautiful but mechanical choreography or something else, that there's no emotion, there's no layer to that. I think it's much more difficult to, it can be much more challenging as a spectator to see what's going on, and you're going to be trying to make up some narratives. But as soon as there's emotion, as soon as there's something we can kind of sink our teeth into, it's like, you know, getting into the fast lane of understanding. I get what's going on, and this makes a lot more sense to me. And I think coming back to these points that Joel and Sunny were making about faces versus not faces, the body is so important. Like, of course the face, we have faces, we're looking at faces. When I'm speaking right now, most people probably aren't looking at my knee, they're looking at my face, because this is where the signal's coming from. But if you were 20 meters off in the distance, like, all in so many different social situations, what people's bodies are doing, the tension they hold. And I was going to see the tension in the puppets too, because the one who was reading Freud, felt very tense as he was leaning over. The other one was kind of a bit more floppy. So there's so many cues, and the face helps. The face augments. The face is another one of these shortcuts because there's so much that's written on it. But the body, I think, we'd be lost without the physicality of the body as well.
I mean, these just on the faces, these puppets are designed and made by Adrian Kohler of Handspring, and he's a brilliant sculptor. And one of the things that puppet makers and designers often have to come across is, what are you going to do with that face? If you're going to make a face, you have to make it. If you make it smiling, then you're going to struggle to play sadness. And so there's this incredible art, sculptural art, in sculpting faces that are asymmetric, usually. So kind of one side of the face shows something slightly different from the other. I noticed in Adrian's puppets quite often that their mouths look like they're about to say something. So there's a kind of expression on your face when you're nearly saying something which is completely ambiguous, because that might go in any direction. And this kind of art, the puppet is in some way an empathy machine. Then, we need to find out how do you activate this moment of maximum potential in the audience, where you can, where you're opening up the maximum number of possible narratives, or the appropriate number of possible narratives, and in trying to get all of these empathy mechanisms to work. And again, these sort of, what to me are relatively recent, maybe not to you guys, inquiries into how the body, and my perception of my body and my perception of your body when I look at you are kind of mapped and blurred, seem really interesting to me as someone who makes bodies for people to look at. And I don't know if that's activated by this sort of movement, or posture, or tension.
There's sort of an interesting analogy to that. If you make emotional stimuli, psychology experiments, so it's very common. You would take two facial emotional expressions, say a sad face and a happy face, and you want, for experimental reasons, you want to have a whole continuum of faces that are intermediate between them. So you can morph the two faces and make a whole range of faces. But if you take the one that's midway between sadness and happiness, it doesn't look either sad or happy, but it also doesn't look like a neutral face. It doesn't look quite like someone making a neutral expression. It looks more ambiguous than that. And that's, I've always thought that's just kind of a quirk of these sorts of stimuli, but it latched on to what you were saying about what the puppet maker is doing, is trying to create this deliberately ambiguous, which is not the same as neutral.
No.
Sort of expression, which then you can, as a puppeteer, can presumably push in other ways.
You'd have to be confident that happy and sad are opposites, wouldn't you, to think that the midpoint was neutral?
Well, maybe you have to make certain assumptions about what the dimensionality of emotional space is.
Yeah.
It's a bigger question.
Yeah, that sounds hard.
So this is probably related to what you were talking about earlier when you say sometimes if you draw a face on a stick, it doesn't work, right? So when you don't draw the face on the stick, the face of the bird or whatever you're seeing is supplied by you. You're imagining it. With the faces of the puppets, right? If you have enough cues there to be suggestive of everything, right? It's in a certain way, it's like leaving the stick blank, right? Rather than telling people this is the expression that this character is pulling, because then you can't manipulate the sort of the more blank canvas by movement and content.
But it does something else as well. I agree with that, but it also makes the puppet thwarted, doesn't it? I mean, the puppet is trying to say something yet forever can't say something. It's a very distinctive look of those puppets.
Yeah, you can't go too far.
But that sort of sense of which it maybe relates more to what we'll come on to talk about, which is the very sort of actual circumstances of a puppet in a theatre. But the idea that the puppet itself is cannot articulate is also part of the sentimental relationship with them, I think. But that's slightly offbeat for what we're talking about.
Can I just add something? Because I think we all downplayed the role of the face a little bit, and at the same time, because in the research the face was considered super important, and now there's this backlash in the literature, but at the same time I want to emphasize that faces do something, and I think there's a reason why you now had these puppets and not two sticks reading these books. And because, for instance, when you look at these faces, you immediately, I don't know whether you had this impression, but you think they're two men, not two women, the way the appearance was and so on, so you immediately put them in categories. And maybe Emily remembers this study better, but there's a really nice study where they ask people, with a robot, do you think it has emotions, it feels pain, blah, blah, blah. And when we consciously reply to these things, often we are like, no, of course not, it's a thing, it doesn't. But then one of the dependent measures was that they would take the robot and throw it into the corner. And they basically measured what the response was, how you responded to seeing the robot being mistreated. And with these puppets, if you would just throw them in the corner, I would immediately go like, more than with the stick. And I think that is really because we have that face which immediately suggests humanity. And even though I still am aware this is a thing, I think the link that we connect with this thing is much quicker there than with another thing that is not having these facial features. So I don't want us to assume that not having a face or having an ambiguous face is the same thing. I don't think so. I think having a human face is a big thing for humans, because that's the moment where we think this is potentially conspecific, and our emotional response is very different to something that may or may not have a face.
Well, this thing, because I wanted to pick up on something that Mervyn said. Mervyn called puppets an empathy machine, which I thought was quite a striking. Do you agree? Are puppets an empathy machine?
Absolutely. I think this is the challenge and the magic of the puppeteer, is to use that tool, as you described them. That's just what they are. This really sophisticated tool to draw out the audience's investment and their interest. And people pay money to sit in these shows because you're able to, with materials and inanimate objects, really kind of have people invested in this potentially deeply emotional experience, as in Warhorse, as in many other situations. I think, that when done well, that's exactly what puppetry seems to be, is an empathy machine.
But in terms of what's happening in what we're bringing to the table in terms of that, so if the puppet is a machine, what needs to happen for it to work is not just the puppeteer, is it?
No, because this is the top down. This is the audience contract. This is what the viewer, the spectator brings in the. We don't want to. It seems like we don't want to say suspension of disbelief, but like in being willing in this contract and kind of engaging this make believe, whatever it is, to say that I'll go along with this and let my kind of sophisticated human social cognition be co-opted to imbue and to travel along with the puppeteer's narrative.
But I suppose I was pushing on this empathy machine because empathy isn't a word that we've spoken about at all really here, and yet probably for most of us that would probably be the first thing that we would say, I guess we're kind of empathising with the puppets, that's probably how we'd explain it. So is empathy a kind of superstructure to describe all of these specific things that are going on, or
in the
relevant?
philosophical literature, and I'm sure this is sort of entirely familiar to everyone else, broadly speaking, to ways of thinking about how we go about engaging, interpreting others. Right? So there's one view which is sometimes called the theory, which says that what we have is an innate theory of how the mind works. and we're not aware of all the features of this theory, but it's what we bring to bear on people that we see in order to interpret what they're up to, what we think they believe, and so on. So it's often thought of on the model of our understanding of grammar. So we have the idea is that we have an understanding of how sentences get put together so that we can distinguish between a grammatical sentence and an ungrammatical sentence, even though if you were to ask me, I would be very bad at telling you what the rules of, what the syntactic rules of English are. I can speak it, but that's the theory view. And the other view is the empathy type of view, sometimes called simulationism. So the thought there is that the way in which we go about interpreting other people is we do something like, and there's different ways of describing it, different versions of the view, but we do something like project ourselves into the situation of the person that we're interpreting. So on one way of understanding that, that involves the imagination. So you imagine being in the position of the puppet that you see, and that's how you work out what it is that they can see. You basically are implicitly thinking, what would I see if I was sitting there? And then you can retroactively explain some of their, or interpret them as having certain emotional states, because you think, okay, they just did that. What would I have been doing that for? And so if I had done that, that would be because I was trying to communicate to the guy sitting next to me that I want him to be quiet. Something along those lines, right? So empathy often gets used in that sense as sort of like taking a perspective other than your own, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And I think that most people now think that the interpretation of others involves elements of both of those things, right? So it involves some form of projective, empathizing, simulating other people, but it also involves some level of general beliefs we have about the mind and how the mind works, such that we attribute emotions, other mental states, more generally, sort of using elements of each one of those strategies.
And in those, I want to ask you guys whether that resonates with how you see it as well, but just quickly, within those two ways of thinking, is there any space, is it relevant to talk about the kind of more spooky versions of kind of catching other people's emotions or being infected, but in the way that you might feel that you walk into a room and feel an atmosphere or something like that?
Well, certainly, I mean, one noticeable feature of puppets is that they don't have any emotions, so you couldn't literally catch, it's a metaphor, but you couldn't be infected by the emotion that they have. But certainly the way that some people think about empathy or perspective taking is that what happens is that once you've simulated, once you've put yourself in the position of the other person, then you get a little version of the emotional state or whatever that you would have in that situation, and then you categorize that, and then you go, oh well, that's what they must have.
Okay.
So there's that sort of element of
little tingle of
sharing involved in certainly what a lot of people call empathy.
So does that version of things resonate with you?
Yes, so I think Julie's exactly right to bring up that distinction between theory and simulation theory. But I think there's even a more basic way of thinking about it, because I'm not entirely comfortable with the phrasing of that the machines, but I worry that my hesitance is maybe a semantic quibble rather than actually disagreeing with the substance of the claim. The word empathy, so it's very clear that in a situation like the two puppets that we just saw, that we attribute mental states and emotions to the puppets. But that in itself doesn't really seem to be enough to say that we empathize with them. So empathy would involve not merely that we attribute mental states to them, but that we ourselves share those mental states, or that we ourselves experience the same emotions they're experiencing. And I didn't particularly feel that I had an empathic reaction, but perhaps more of a sympathetic reaction. I sympathize with the irritation of the one puppet, but I don't feel that I myself experienced irritation. And so there's maybe this is kind of a technical quibble about the usage of the words, but it's not obvious to me that the interesting phenomenon that I attributed to the puppets was really empathy as opposed to sympathy or some other attribution.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in response to that, and also in a sense to the question about whether the sticks, whether you can fall in love with the stick, the sticks can play that scene quite well. I agree with you. I think that at this point you're happy to see the sticks dropped on the floor, but not puppet. But I would also say that across a longer show, you might look at crossing the line between sympathy and empathy.
Sure, I'm not.
And
certainly,
in a way, the question would be, could you potentially see how that might happen?
Oh, absolutely.
With these?
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to imagine how empathy could be generated by these. But if it was merely a sympathetic and not a fully empathic reaction, it would. I don't think that would be a counterexample to what is really interesting about it.
That's right. I think we talked about the sceptical audiences already a little bit. We should later as well. And I think as a performer, you're aware that although some of the people might be empathising with you, many of them are only sympathising.
And on that bombshell.
I'm not sure only is the right way to put it.
Yeah. Well, absolutely, yeah. There's a whole different layer of emotions.
There's nothing wrong with sympathy.
thank you. I think you have to run, but thank you very much for the question. I'll have to send you an email. What beautiful work. So, Mervyn, tell us a bit about that.
Well, I suppose the choice of the three pieces, which we kind of worked up this morning, was a thought that with the objects you have a really limited amount of information to work with, as we've said. And if you're puppeteering those objects, then you know instinctively in a way that there are different things that the audience will respond to, and you quite often play close, a little bit what I would call closer to the animal, although they're perfectly capable of feeling kind of complex social and human thoughts. There's something that might be interesting for us to talk about, which is that socially humans try to repress some of their physical body language, and you would find with that kind of puppet that you allow some of that to come a little bit close to the surface. The second piece clearly was a bit more about trying to give you a more figurative puppet that could do a social interaction, and then the third one was really to remind us that the puppets aren't always trying to be like people, and that well, quite a lot of my professional life is spent working with theatre companies who would like a puppet to behave in a naturalistic way, like an animal to behave like an animal. But that's absolutely not the limit of what puppets do, and certainly not of what puppets do successfully. So one of the things that puppets do successfully is the impossible. And yet, even when the puppet character, a puppet character might, while feeling angst, might curl itself up into a ball, or disintegrate, or float up into the air, or explode. The audience is potentially quite happy to relate to that as an emotional experience, even though the physical expression of it is neither realistic or familiar or plausible. So I just thought it might be useful to throw us into a slightly different meaning of what the puppet does, which is not completely imitative as well, to push us into the next bit of chat.
Well, the very distinctive thing about that was with these bodies coming apart, wasn't it? And where we ended the last conversation was partly an idea that if puppets are sort of empathy machines, then part of what's going on is that we're relating our bodies to what those bodies are doing, and then feeding back into some sort of glimmer of that emotion, and then feeding that back into how we perceive them. Can that process work if heads are flying off shoulders and the body is cut in half? What do you think?
I think it definitely can. I think to just throw a tiny bit more theory in, we had theory, and simulation theory. Another theory that psychology has from developmentalists is known as the like-me theory, and it suggests that a lot of our understanding of the social world is these are ideas that we've been talking about. In other ways, we use ourselves as a template. So I can make sense of you because you look like me, or you move like me, you have a body like me. But of course, we're really good at understanding all sorts of social intentions for things that are not looking or acting or moving or having anything at all like me. So you can think about the film WALL-E, you can think about lots of other Pixar animations, all sorts of Disney, like lots and lots of animation. We imbue all sorts of non-embodied entities with very real, rich emotional lives and intentions and desires. So I think you don't necessarily need yourself and your bodily experience to make sense, and you can still very much see what's going on with the torso and legs decoupling. And I think that some of the neuroscience research is showing us is even these mirror neuron type regions of the brain, these parts of the brain that link up perception with action. In my experience with what I'm seeing others doing, our brains are much more flexible. We don't have to have the other agent looking and moving just like us in order to use these same simulation mechanisms. And that much greater flexibility in information processing, in artistic processing, I think gives the artist or performer a lot more latitude in what they might put on stage and what might capture an audience member.
I remember reading an article about the mirror neuron system, implying, and I know there's a lot of discussion about all of these kind of recent things, that in some way the responses to the, well, from my biased point of view, I was excited to see that it seemed to say that sometimes the responses to the goal and, in a way, the feeling of the movement rather than the mechanism of the movement at all, and that felt really useful as a performer to say, okay, well, I'm not trying to copy something so that people can recognise it from a theoretical point of view, or even so that their subconscious brain can react because it's a perfect match to the right movement. We're looking for some qualitative kind of feel that relates, and that feels like I'd love to know how that works, more about how that works, or whether that's to do with this slippery embodiment of, is what we're doing making that enough like a body for us to feel that it's a body?
Well, to the extent that we can easily attribute mental states to sticks or drawers, as we saw in the first performance, or to triangles and circles in the height of the symbol work that Emily mentioned, given that, it's not shocking that we can attribute emotions to a pair of legs or an upper torso. What was interesting to me about that piece is that the choreographer, puppet director, has deliberately used that to conflict with the fact that we ordinarily attribute mental states to a particular level of biological organization that of an individual. But the mechanisms by which this happens don't seem to be surprising, given that it seems much more striking to attribute mental states to a stick or a triangle.
I think one thought I had is, I mean, what I love, and I think maybe that's what Mervyn is opening up, is that obviously with puppetry, anything can suddenly turn from a non-agent into an agent. So in the moment, first we're thinking it's sitting on a stone that happens to look like a skull, but suddenly that thing becomes also something animate. So you can play completely with, in real life obviously we have expectations, something's animate or it isn't, but in the puppetry world anything can suddenly be animate or not animate. But I come back to that point that I would like to go about how people respond to that, because I think some people loved it, and I think that goes also in the direction of when you read poetry that often ignites certain emotions with words and associations that in itself have nothing to do with that state, but they trigger some abstract feeling that then, or they trigger associations that then trigger the feeling you want to achieve. And I think some people like that. But I do also think some people are not very open to that. And just maybe giving you a little bit of another analogy, with Game of Thrones, I think a lot of people are watching that, and that was a show that started very realistic, maybe Middle Ages, whatever, but it's making this big move now into more magical thinking. Suddenly there are dragons, suddenly there's a lot of higher powers that people in the beginning talked about, like being just stories. And I think for some people who were watching the show, that was like, oh, that's an exciting development. And for some people, it's like, oh, now it's getting into this magical shit I'm no longer interested in. and I think that is an interesting question, how people respond to that. You know, does it have to be realistic what I'm looking at? And do I like when things that are animate can suddenly be inanimate, and when these boundaries suddenly disappear? Or do I need that for me to think about the world, to appreciate the world, that I like that these things are separate? And there's a lot of research, you know, how we respond to certain visual cues and so on, but I think there's currently, I'm not aware of any research on, you know, why for some people that is a border that shouldn't be crossed, and for some people that is something where the thinking gets ignited and they find it really exciting. And I think with Mervyn, and maybe he has a bit more experience there, but when we talked, I also was fascinated by, so who goes to puppetry shows, and is there also a type of person who wouldn't go, you know, and why wouldn't they go? And this is where I think the empathy machine comes in a little bit again. So some people are willing to empathize or to sympathize, and I think for some people it's just like, I'm exaggerating, but it's like this waste of time. Why would I look at a stick and suddenly think about what the stick appears? And I find that such a stunning divide in people, you know, that for some that is like, well, clearly we're learning something about human nature, even if it's a stick, and for others it's like, no, it's a stick, you know.
And
We have, sorry.
And so I think it just emphasizes again this point, like what are people bringing to the table and what are those who are not engaging, not bringing to the table or refusing to bring to the table. And this is lacking a little bit in this discussion, I think, because I guess everyone sitting in a room is sort of open to puppetry.
Yeah, self-selecting audience. Do you want
We're going
to, we used to talk about this when we were rehearsing Warhorse, and we used to talk about the, because it was a show where people would often bring their families. So there's proportionally, if there is a proportion in the population who aren't interested in puppetry, that some of them must be there because they're going to be related to people, unless it's purely genetic, and even then they might be married. There's going to be some skeptics in the audience, and actually that was absolutely stated to me as one of the sort of canonical principles. If you must play for the skeptic, because the sympathizer is already on your side. So you know what you're thinking about when you're watching that as a director and putting together the sequences. Okay, if I'm not impressed by magic, if I don't see the point in puppets, how are you going to win me over or let me understand what's of value in this? And I think it's a live question for anyone making any sort of art. Actually, why should I be interested in sculpture or painting or anything? And that's part of the experience of going. But maybe that's a bigger question than we can take.
No, but I think it's an interesting one. I wanted to ask Joel about this as well. I mean, in history and in the philosophy of science in particular, there is a kind of very live debate. In fact, we were even having this debate last week in a reading group about objects and whether an object can ever have agency. And there are some historians that are like, no, you know, a handkerchief is just a handkerchief, nothing. And then there are other historians who are, and I would be more in this camp, who are like, well, maybe you can think of some objects as having agency, maybe having an impact in the world that they are in. You know, it's not just about what we do to the object can do stuff back to us. And there are other historians like, no, that's not going to happen. So I'm interested from a philosophical point of view, whether you think that that boundary that you're talking about between object and agent is really as strict as all that.
I don't think handkerchiefs are agents, but I think that we are objects. So I'm not 100% certain of the contrast being drawn, but certainly I think for something to be an agent, you have to have the capacity to act, and that has to involve more than just causing things to happen or moving. So the earth moves, the sun moves, causes things to happen. I think when you attribute agency to something in the sense in which we ordinarily mean it, you do think of something much more, such that the movements are controlled by something like an intention. And so that when we're interpreting the puppets, we're interested in, amongst other things, their intentions, what their goals are, what they're trying to achieve. And insofar as you're thinking of them as things with agency, I think you have to be thinking of them as things with goals. So I guess I'm not familiar with the debate that you mentioned, but I guess I'm on the side of the historians who think that handkerchiefs are just handkerchiefs.
But when a body is when a human is possibly an object, I'm thinking about Birkbeck or someone like that. You know, that there is suddenly a moment when the human can have agency in the world, but no intention, no goal, just, you know, slipping on a banana skin and setting off a chain of events that result in X person being run over by a bus.
So inanimate objects can certainly make things happen.
But that's not
pretty clear. I think that is different from agency, and the way in which our all sorts of our social and interpersonal practices reflect that. So simply making something happen doesn't make you responsible for that thing. So it may be, if you push me and then I jog into someone else and that other person falls over, you wouldn't hold me responsible for that, because whilst I made it happen, I was I played my role in the chain of events that had that outcome. I wasn't the agent, because it wasn't an action of mine, it was in fact an action of yours.
But by that thinking, isn't it the case that you wouldn't hold the puppet responsible for anything that's going on stage, because it's the hand of the actor, the puppeteer, that's doing it?
Yeah, so I think that's where you have to draw the puppet character distinction. So I don't think we do hold the puppet responsible. You don't hold the brush responsible for breaking pain, but you might hold the character responsible for actions that they perform. Or, I mean, it's difficult to know exactly how to describe that stuff, but actions which you're imagining that they're performing or something like that. So yeah, I think that's okay.
The separation of the character and the puppeteer has come up for me quite a lot in this thing when I've been trying to put any of this together in it. I suppose it's something that you do anyway when you're preparing a performance, is think about the character as a thing. I was interested when you described them, what did you call them, theoretical entity. It's created. When we imagine that character sufficiently clearly, and it struck me that what's different between making a performance where I play Lady Bracknell and a performance where a puppet plays Lady Bracknell is that I'm putting that character into this space. I'm not asking you to blur the line between my body and the character's body. I'm creating a vessel carved out of wood or whatever it's made from, and putting it between us and saying, let's both put our ideas about Lady Bracknell here in this thing. And that feels to me like quite a fundamental difference in performance and in terms of what you're asking the audience to do. And it seems to crystallise for me in a way, if you watch Judi Dench in a play or a film, you know it's Judi Dench. It's always Judi Dench in it. I mean, you know, it's still her, whoever else is playing, and however else is playing. That's not a slight on Judi Dench. You know, any excellent actor who you've seen many times brings with them all the memories and associations of all of the other roles you've seen them in, and the fact that they look like that lady who works down at Sainsbury's, and the fact that what they're wearing reminds you of something that your great aunt used to have. The puppet has the option of not doing some of that stuff. And so it might be that that changes the way we're stimulating the imagination of the audience by not having a body, but by somehow putting those rhythms and movements into something proxy. I haven't finished the thought in my head either.
Does anyone have any? Because you're all sort of nodding, like, yeah.
Yeah, that's why I thought they might be able to pick me up.
Joel, a couple times, has brought up this nice distinction between the character and the performer. I think was the terminology you used. And I've been interested, as we've been talking about the issue of animacy, is that the issue of animacy in the puppet seems quite different from this distinction, because the distinction between the performer and the character shows up with an actor, with Judi Dench, just as much as it shows up with the puppet. And so I've been thinking about this as if that distinction, Joel's distinction, shows up in the same way with the puppet and the actor, but that with the puppet there's this additional animacy thing.
Apparent.
But now, listening to you talk, it makes me think that actually maybe it's not just that there's a common character-performer distinction in both cases with an additional animacy bit in the puppet, but that there's a more qualitative difference between the two situations. But I don't have an opinion on this.
That might be right. So I guess here are two different ways in which you might think about what's going on, and I don't know which one's right. I've been talking as though the distinction between the actor and the character that they're playing, between Harrison Ford and Han Solo, that's the same as the distinction between the puppet, piece of wood or whatever it is, and the character, bird, animal, whatever, that they're playing. But obviously there's a third element, which is the person who's controlling it. But it might not be like that at all, right? So it may be that what happens is something more like this. It's like a game of role play, or sorry, not role play, pretense, where you say, okay, let's, like in a child's game, let's pretend that this stick is a sword. And so there's a sort of an agreement, as people were saying earlier, to treat one thing as though it were another. And so there you might think that the distinction between the character is much closer to the actual puppet than they are to the actor. Even though initially it seems the other way around, because you think, well, it's much easier to conflate actor and character since they're both human beings and they're both standing in the same place. And they look the same. The character's got to look like that actor, but the character in the puppet case, you sort of imagine more. In many cases, you imagine that there's more of it there than you can actually see. I don't know if this is the same with others, but with the brush and the head, I was sort of imagining an invisible body linking these things. It wasn't Mervyn's body. And so you might think, oh, there's an obvious distinction, like much easier distinction to be drawn between the materials, the actor, the real flesh and blood person, and the character that they're playing, on the one hand, in the puppet case than there is in non-puppetry. But actually that might not be right. So sorry.
This sounds like what Mervyn was saying with having this entity, this puppet's body, or these materials that are serving as a puppet. It's this agreement between the puppeteer and the audience that we're going to both invest that with something. So as you say, if it's an actual actor, like you can't take the character out of Harrison Ford because Harrison Ford is Han Solo, so this person is this actor. But if it is a paintbrush and a skull, like then these two objects, everyone can kind of be about these individual differences. Like that Sunny was saying, everyone can kind of imbue that with their own reality, and there's not as much baggage with the real physical instantiation of the person there. And I think maybe that's part of the magic of puppetry in many ways, because it's much more flexible. Maybe it's more difficult too.
To watch?
Well, for some people, right? This is the people maybe who don't want to come along with the imagination play.
But I think there's something in, I mean, we sometimes say it's more effort. Or the audience are working harder to imagine that character. I don't know if they're working actually, it might be that they're enjoying harder. Or it might be that they're relating more fully, you might call it. But there's certainly something, there's some difference there, isn't there, in terms of what's activated.
You said actually that one of the things that you had, that sort of set you off on this path was noticing the difference between audiences when they're watching actors in a play and when they're watching the bit that the puppet is in. What is the quality of the difference?
I was anxious before I started whether this might just be a feature of novelty, because of course we're very, very used to watching people behave, and we're very, very used to watching people pretend to behave in fictional contexts. And it might be that the reason that people seem to lean forward in their seats when the puppet comes on stage is because they've not seen one before, or they've not seen this as often before, and actually, oh, there's a new stimulus here, I need to just kind of really focus myself on the action. And that may well be the case, and if that's the case, then I apologise for making you all come here. But it might also be that there's something else going on, that this literally stimulates you in a different way, not just because of its novelty, but because there's gaps in the image. There's one of the neurologists has a theory about kind of super stimulation. So sculptures are kind of more strikingly made in such a way that it'll activate you more. Is this theatre turned up in some way? I'm not sure. But yes, it feels like there's an intensity of engagement that can be more full.
I would argue the other way around. So with humans, we always have this, and this is why stereotyping and prejudice happen, that no matter what you wear, I can judge usually whether you're male or female, your age roughly based on your movement and posture, and often, unless you're completely covered, I can judge the features, so the racial background the person has, and we call them the 3 big social categories. And with these things alone, if I look at you and you say you're a white, young woman, I already have this sense of feeling I know something about you. Yeah, so probably you're not, and this might be completely wrong, but probably the stereotypes are you wouldn't play football on a Sunday, rather you go shopping, things like this. And with puppets, you're stripping all of this away. So we have in the beginning no entry point, no obvious entry point what this thing is. So we really have to work, which in a way makes the human essence underneath it more accessible, right? Because we can be misled in different directions. So rather than super stimulating, I think you're understimulating, but due to this understimulation, you have to work harder to get there. Whereas with humans, we should be doing this, but we are not, because usually we get all these visual cues and we think, oh, I've sort of figured you out. And I think that is, for me, what I find so fascinating with puppets, because as you come on stage in the beginning, I don't know what you are. I don't know whether you're male and female, whether you're old or young, and these things seem to matter when we think about agents, right? And there we have no idea.
I had a question for you on that topic, because I know you do some work into advertising, and of course, the advertisers are our most fearsome enemies in terms of being manipulated, right? And it strikes me that advertisers use puppets disproportionately high, and there's a lot of puppets in advertising, sometimes in order that the character can be blue instead of have a racial characteristic, but sometimes for other reasons, and I wondered if that was something that...
Well, I'm looking at this a little bit, but I do think, because obviously we do have this clear bias, so most people using advertising are white, are young, and so on. But you're right, I think, and you see a trend to more puppets, but I think because they want to avoid that they are only targeting certain groups of people. They want to make the accessibility as wide as possible without using this human component. So they want to still draw you in without saying this is a white woman, and if you're a white woman, you will not now identify with this product. So if we give you a blue puppet, now everyone can relate to this, but I can still portray that they are happy or excited and so on. So I think they're using these puppets again in order to, because generally the idea of advertising is, you know, that you need a character that draws you in, and often this character relies on this like me idea. You need to identify with what you're seeing. But that from a marketing perspective means you're limiting who you're marketing to, and I think they're starting to avoid this by giving portrayals, either what you sometimes see, that they are now just showing the product and no longer people in that world, or that rather than showing real human people, they start showing puppets. So with a lot of serials, you see puppeteers being used, also in print adverts. It's interesting, and I really think, I mean, I've never talked to a marketing person so far, because I'm just starting a lot of this work, but I wondered about this, whether they are trying to avoid these social categories. Yeah.
It's a series of Dutch cartoons, 2 children, Jip and Janneke, and the 2 children are shadows, and it was deliberately done so as not to have to identify the racial background of the characters, so that all Dutch children would be able to identify them. So their age and sex is clear, but the race isn't. It's sort of a deliberate attempt to do exactly what you just said.
That's interesting, because I remember when they started using a lot more puppets in adverts, which was probably about 15 or 20 years ago, they started coming in noticeably. And my mother's an actress, and she'd say, "Oh, they're just trying to avoid paying the equity." So I should go back and tell her what really. Maybe we're being too naive. It's so expensive to employ an actor for an advert, but it's cheap to employ a puppet. Does that contract that we're that keeps on being brought up, how does that contract work? How does it happen? And when does it happen? I mean, clearly it can happen in an advert, so on TV as well as in a theatre and a live environment like this. So how does it evolve? When do we make it?
When I was talking to Susanne when we first met, I remember her saying, I was showing a bit of puppetry, and we were talking about whether a movement was meaningful. And she said, well, of course, when I walk into a theatre, I expect you to tell me a story that makes sense. And I thought, oh yeah, do you? And of course, you know, in the theatre, you know, or in a film, or in any context where you're using a puppet, actually, you do know that it's being done on purpose, and you do know that this is supposed to be somebody doing something, reacting to something. So it's, although I think it's important that we go back to the first principles of what is it we're responding to in terms of form and motion and rhythm and quality of movement, they don't exist on their own. You know, we're not responding to them on their own, we're always responding to them in the context of an emotion which is happening in response to an action which is causing the next action. And all of this, we know, is being done in order to tell a story or develop a relationship. And so I think that contract's sort of implicit as soon as the puppet's there, in a way that a human body in a social situation does not have that frame. Is that true?
Well, in many situations we didn't.
Any situation.
If we go into a restaurant, we can certainly have expectations about how the waiter or waitress is going to interact with us and how we order. There are lots of rules and social conventions that we bring to bear in any situation. Of course, we have the social, we know something about the social context in which a performance, whether it's a piece of puppetry or acting, occurs. And it's not clear to me that that's really any different from other sorts of social conventions in any other situation.
So we have a question about whether sometimes this comes up about how the audience manage to not see the puppeteers, but by which we mean that they don't pay attention to the movements they're making because they're not important to the story. I don't pay attention to the way the waiter moves unless they do something unusual, right?
It's like magicians, though, right? Like this is how magic works, and I'm sure you can argue that puppetry is a type of magic. The skillful performer is directing your attention to something in particular. The skillful waiter, you're not supposed to notice them, you're supposed to notice what they're bringing you, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's the directing of attention. This is why theater is so, there's so many layers to it, because there's the director's eye, there's the performer's intentionality, there's where your eye should be guided. And we've all been to theater performances where things do go awry, and all of a sudden the fourth wall breaks, and everything's kind of a bit.
Pay no attention.
Yeah, pay no attention to that. It's all very awkward. So I think there's a lot of attention going on, and attention's a fiendishly complicated thing to study. I teach it to my second-year undergraduates. And we all know what it is, and yet to describe it and study it is good luck. It's really complicated, and we kind of chip away at it bit by bit. But I think there's a lot to do with attention and intention and where the audience's eye is guided. And I just want to make a really small, but I think important distinction between live and filmed performance. And this is, I know not the point of this, but I think they're really different things. And when you think about a commercial on TV, a feature film that you might see in a cinema, what's going on there? Oftentimes the director, the editor is going to decide where your eye is going to be, and there's not the whole scene. But in a rich theater, live performance, you can look at the person playing a Roman guard in the corner, you can look at the main actor, the actress, all the different things that are on the theater, and this is on the stage could possibly be taking your attention. And I think what's happening is really quite different in terms of what has to be done to engage an audience to follow the story in the way that the performers and the director want it to actually happen.
And I think another thing, if I understood your question correctly, I think a big thing to why we like puppeteering, is that a thing? Puppetry? Sometimes making up words. I think it has a big human dimension. No, we haven't talked about this at all, but of course the moment the upper body is trying to catch his lower body, that is funny. Or like the two sticks fighting, or right now, I don't know whether anyone's watching the Great British Bake Off, where they have now these little cakes before him that are talking. The first time I saw that, I thought that was hilarious. So, I mean, often about these things, they can be fascinating because they are funny, and of course because you start to think, what would it be like if all things had a mind, right? And if all things had intentions and would come to life. I think think that is an interesting question that has been explored for many ways, and I think you're sort of also with this form of art tapping into this more broader question.
Is that part of what you think makes you laugh? Is a sort of oddity or even the surrealism of these things coming to life?
I think so. I mean, this is a completely personal opinion. This has nothing to do with my science, but I do think that that humor and taking a step back from the world and realizing that, you know, a human showing exactly the same behavior would be funny, but because it's a chair or a piece of cake, it's suddenly hilarious. And I think that this is an aspect of it. But maybe Mervyn says no, nothing is funny when we do puppetry. No, but I'm very serious.
But not often enough.
Not everything, no, but.
Absolutely. No, I mean, it's you try and be funny as often as you can. Yes. I was struck by Matthew saying in the beginning, I've read about this rubber hand illusion a lot, but it's the first time someone has told me that it's fun. Because I've never done it myself, but you know, it's studied in a lot of, you see this written down a lot about this beautiful illusion that tells you that your sense of body image is very fragile. But I guess you've done it. Seen it done.
Yeah, I mean, subjects start to giggle when they have this experience, and they giggle exactly because of the conflict between their experience and what they know about the situation, which is, I think, why seeing the legs and the torso struggle against each other is funny, because it contrasts with our usual experience. So yeah, I mean, as an experimenter, you try to set the tone. This is a serious experiment, and we're scientists, and we're trying to do this. But you know, there's something a bit comedic about this prosthetic hand in front of the subject, and when people have this experience, it's funny to them.
And when you talk about the visual illusions that may or may not be an analogue for what is happening, that's also fun, isn't it? When you look at a visual illusion and you imagine the devious psychologist behind it.
Yeah,
you and they are having a kind of interaction through this swimming page or whatever.
I mean, you know, there are books for popular audiences about 50 great visual illusions, in which there aren't about 50 great reaction time experiments. That's because the illusions are captivating and interesting and yes, fun. You see, I mean, even if you're not interested in what they tell us about the way human perceptual systems work, they can be striking and interesting and fun.
Well, of course, many artists also, like Dali and others, kind of use our perceptual system and understanding how we see bodies and faces and make all sorts of art that capitalizes on these things.
But it might also be a moment in the way that Joel was talking about how humans can become objects. It's almost perhaps part of what we're laughing at is our ability to perform in this kind of automatic way that's not quite where we were intending to go. I always find puppetry funny because I think I'm surprised that my brain is willing to see that as real. You know, that makes me laugh.
Are there people for whom puppetry does not work at all? Are there any clinical disorders? I don't know if anyone knows anything that just, you can't see it. Like we know people have strokes, different parts of the brain. You don't see motion and you don't see objects in the same way. Is there anyone?
I haven't heard of that. I have heard, I mean, sometimes children aren't impressed.
That's true for rubber hand illusion as well. Children experience it very strongly, but they're like, yeah, so what?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes a child goes, well, yeah, okay, of course you can make the thing move like a dog. Well, why wouldn't you? So, I mean, yes, maybe it's not, yes, I don't know, I suppose we're trying to, this also came up a little bit when I went to Bodylab. One of the researchers said, how much is the vocal, the audible element active as opposed to the visual element, in terms of getting the audience engaging in the public? I have no idea. I mean, we just try and throw everything at it, at the audience, and hope that they come along with us. I've never tried to measure by removing the vocal element to see what proportion of the audience still like it. So we're not good on data in that sense, but I suppose it would be weird if there was a condition where you really can't respond to any of those things.
No, I guess there's responding, and like there's, guys can correct me if I'm wrong, it's the case that individuals with autism spectrum disorders don't see the Heider and Simmel shapes as having intentionality and don't see them as chasing each other in the same way that people without autism spectrum disorders do see. And I'm not asking a question about autism in particular, but just, you know, the kind of the entry level into the, I can see that there's a relationship between these two sticks, between these two whatever. Is that not read by some groups?
There's definitely good results, I think, from ASD subjects, although I haven't read a lot about it. I know there is work in that field, yeah.
On the subject of children, so one of the ways to think about what's going on is that there's an elaborate game of make-believe. So what we're doing is making believe that this is a whatever. And that's what children do, some children at least, more than others, all the time. So presumably that, at least in part, explains why it's less novel, right? Because that's just standard behavior. Whereas to us, you know, don't play as many games as we used to, then that's one of the reasons why it's fun, right? Games are make believe fun, that's what kids do.
In the second puppet, the human one, I was thinking something that you've just talked about actually, which is what would this be like if two good actors were doing it, and what would the differences be? And what I thought in the end was, and actually this also relates to the children not necessarily being as impressed with puppets as adults, I think it relates anyway, is that I think why we like puppets is that they function a bit like, it's a bit like, the analogy that came into my head was what the new critics said about poetry in the first part of the 20th century, which is poetry is of value because it brings us back to the vitality of language. So we use language all the time in our everyday ways and we deaden it constantly. So metaphors become overused, they become normalised. We lose a sense of the vitality and vivacity of our language, and that's what poetry can do because of its formal, its absolutely formal foregrounding makes you defamiliarise the familiar medium of your language life. And I think that's what the puppet does in relation to the way in which, I mean, one of the things that you can get with a child is you basically say something like, a child says, I don't like Mr. Blah, and you say, why don't you like Mr. Blah? And the child can say, they're really acute about knowing those signs that you've all been talking about that we are basically dealing with unconsciously all the time. A child has still got enough access to knowing what's going on and they can articulate it. Whereas we've just become these normalised, familiar readers of absolutely mammoth amounts of material and complexity of signs all the time. And I think what the puppets do is act a bit like poetry. They defamiliarise, but I mean, in a way, all these little scenes had, I mean, it's interesting that aggression was quite to the fore in all of them. That might say something about you, I have no idea. But there are basically things that, you know, are really kind of normal things, and actually most of us probably even today negotiate something like a potentially aggressive situation. Just normal fabric of stuff, and yet the puppets make us grapple with the extraordinary ordinariness of what we're sort of seeing in our emotional, not just responses, but judgments, you know, everything that makes us able to judge a scene, even a tiny little scene about just two sticks coming together. That's why I think puppets, we like them so much.
Interesting.
I said that really well.
Yeah, really fascinating. What do you think, Matt? What do you think?
I mean, I think something like really. I've forgotten it. There's a. I'm still thinking about some of the things you said. Yeah, that I think you're absolutely right about this idea of poetry and kind of the clarity of expression. There's a Russian puppeteer called Sergei Obraztsov who wrote. I'm going to misremember this, but it's something like that a person can't represent mankind because he's part of that set, but a puppet can represent mankind.
Yeah.
So, and it is true that sometimes you can watch a puppet get out of bed and walk across the room and you would think a different set of things than you would think if you watched an actor do those actions, because the puppet is inherently metaphorical. And yeah, that's definitely different.
Does this relate to your thinking at all about the frame of the theatre and how that might change our, you know, we talked a lot about emotional responses to puppets as if they are like anything else, like humans or like, or maybe like humans, but I wonder whether, you know, the knowledge of it being a theatrical context creates this possibility that you might be able to make the ordinary suddenly seem extraordinary again.
Yes, I suppose it must be. So I think it must be related to, I mean, I too think what you said sounded very plausible, and it must be related to the sort of relative abstractness of puppets. So with a human actor, you have all that extra information about what their particularities, what makes them different from everybody else. And with the puppet, obviously every puppet is different, I guess, but to a certain extent, like in a character, you've abstracted away from those differences and just focusing in on sort of some basic features of persons, which means then presumably that in order to articulate or communicate a particular narrative or a particular way of behaving, what you have to do is sort of work out almost from scratch what is required, for sort of what are the minimal requirements in order to be irritated with someone, or you know, to look like you're walking, or whatever it might be. And so, in a similar sort of way in which, you know, sort of poetry is often at least much more minimal than prose, right? There's less information there, and it makes you focus on more vividly on exactly what the character is doing. You've got less to rely on.
Like a compression.
I was going to say, it's more like a condensed thing rather than being less of it, isn't it?
Well, there's less. Sorry, there's less. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe
so
it's the same. Well, I was going to say maybe it's the same with distillation.
Yeah. There's a lower quantity of information that you're being spoon-fed, and there's more of it's on you. And I think maybe that does relate to the framing of fictional framing of theatrical framing, and maybe this goes back to what Mervyn was talking about, where we don't see the puppeteers, or in a sense, we do see the puppeteers, we don't focus on the puppeteers, and part of the reason for that presumably is that the puppeteers, at least standardly, aren't themselves part of the narrative. So they're there, but the thing that you're actually focusing on excludes them. So there is some very difficult question to answer, I think, some principles that we are implicitly adopting, which determine for us what is and isn't a part of the narrative that we're supposed to be engaging with. The fact that the puppeteer isn't in the narrative is obvious enough, but there's going to be other stuff. It's not, the narrative isn't just limited to the things that we can actually see. There's all sorts of assumptions that we do and are supposed to make, like, you know, the characters are capable of basic reasoning. Maybe they would understand what broadly known facts about the world, you know, what goes up must come down, and all that sort of stuff. But because, but those conventions can be broken, so when you have like a fantastic situation, like, you know, bodies coming apart, your expectations about what's going to be true in this fiction get changed, and because it's so easy to do that stuff with puppets, then again you're constantly being challenged about how it is that you're supposed to be reading the story. And that's what one of the things you were saying was slightly unsettling about some of this stuff, because you don't really know what it is that you're being shown, right? You don't understand in such an easy way what's going on.
In most of the performances, I felt that it was easy for me to tell what I should and should not pay attention to. But there was one point in the final performance when the handle of the brush fell off, and I wasn't sure if that was intended or not, and I wasn't sure if I should be focusing on it. And I started thinking about that. You don't have to say what the answer is. But that was the only case in the 3 performances where I actually sort of found myself uncertain what I should or should not be paying attention to.
How fortuitous, because that wasn't intended, and therefore very handy. It would have been hard to rehearse an accident like that. So, but yeah, I mean, how interesting to be able to look at it and go, that's
but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, that might be, or maybe they're really clever. Okay, you know, it's got a trick puppet, breaking puppet. Okay, yeah. I mean, I think the other thing that in what you said that really resonated with me is this question of how much we take in all the time. And like I say, the first wave of the research that I did was to try and look into perception. And there's kind of 2 things going on in that. It seems like there's a lot of literature about all the stuff that we don't see, change blindness, and all this stuff that we think we see that we're not really seeing because we're predicting it, or we're filling in gaps, or we're assuming it. And then there's another load of stuff about all the stuff that we do see that we don't know that we see, that we're reading all of this body language. And you know, as a layman coming to it and trying to make sense of, you know, so the audience seeing more than I'm intending, or are they seeing less than I'm intending? Do I have to keep clapping my hands and telling them to look over here?
They're seeing different stuff.
And they're projecting different stuff, as Sanderson suggesting, the associations among different people in the audience are different. And at one point I found myself arguing to someone that, oh, we're all experts in reading body language, and so we're constantly interpreting body language in this way. And then I thought, we're all notoriously bad. I mean, the one thing I know about my body language recognition is that I get it wrong all the time. And here I am trying to make performances in which I'm telling myself that the audience are all experts in behavioural recognition. And I haven't unpicked that either.
But I guess this comes back to the distillation of the signal you're giving. You're not giving them the whole thing. You're giving them the poetic elements of it. And maybe this is why puppetry does work for so many people in different ways, but it works, whatever you want to define working as, because people can, you know, make sense of the body language when it's not in the whole social milieu with all the other things that are going on. So maybe give yourself a lot more credit because it's clearly working.
Signal to noise.
Yeah, signal to noise. There you go. Some good psychophys terms. Signal to noise. Anyone else have any thoughts?
Yeah, this is good leading on from distillation. I just wondered if you thought about the uncanny valley and how it just gets weird. I don't know. Yeah.
How it just works?
I don't know. For me personally, it's the gap between reality and puppetry that makes it more convincing. Like if the war horse looked like a real horse, it wouldn't work as well. And I've seen puppet shows use really realistically sculpted puppets that look like human, but they always change the scale, like Ron Mumick's sculpture, and I think that works. But in robotics as well, you have very real-looking people robots that people
Can I say
find really
something
scary.
really small about this? I know Sunny will have things to say as well, and everyone probably will. But it's funny, because Uncanny Valley, I almost brought something up about it in an earlier part of the discussion, and I was really pleased that it hadn't come up until now. Because I think it's really an interesting thing, and probably, does everyone here know what the Uncanny Valley is? Yeah, okay. So we know that it's something to avoid if we're robotics designers or if we're puppeteers in many ways too. Like, people don't want to feel creeped out unless you're watching a zombie film, then people do want to feel creeped out. But I think my biggest issues with the Uncanny Valley there's not a lot of really good research on it. It remains a theory, and it's very different when something's still versus moving. And of course, puppetry is moving, and lots of the robotics that are now being created they want them dynamic, they want them moving, and it can really be an amplified effect. But we just don't really fully understand what the effect is. I think people think that it's all figured out, and like the uncanny valley is this: if it gets too human-like, it drops down, and then once it's actually human-like or real, then people like it again. But there's just so much we don't know, and I think you wonderfully avoided anything like the uncanny valley with all the things that you showed us here. But I'm sure it's something like this eeriness and this issue that people have with something that just doesn't feel quite right. And some of the thinking now has to do with another idea that came up today, which is violation of expectations or prediction error. So I expect a person to move like this, or if the robot looks that human-like, it should behave that human-like, but then when it doesn't, that's a real problem for me. But I think there's still so much more we need to know, and I encourage everyone to never just use uncanny valley as a fairly easy kind of like, oh, that's what's happening there, because we just don't really quite know what it is and when it happens. But to think about it is interesting. Do you have things to say?
Yeah. Do you have anything to add? No, just I think from your perspective, because one problem in the literature is that people use the terms, what the emotion is that you have as a perceiver already loosely. So is it just about whether you like or don't like what you're seeing, or is eeriness about something being strange and unfamiliar, or it's about freaking you out? So these are all very different emotional states and gets all lumped into together. And I think that makes it even harder to understand the uncanny valley, because you can not like something but still not be freaked out by it, or you can like something even though it freaks you out. And I think people are just starting to tear apart these things. And if you work with robots, and I think that again is Emily's topic, to be honest, we know a lot of the eeriness effects go away very quickly. So even if you have a sense of eeriness in the beginning, you know, once you are exposed to the robot a little bit longer, people tend to no longer have that feeling. With puppetry, for instance, I have to say I find puppets extremely eerie, and for me that doesn't go away. But this is totally personal, so I think that, you know, that is, I think what Emily also means, we just don't understand really yet what's going on and whether there are different types of eeriness and what's driving them, but this simple idea of there's this valley, and once you are really human-like, you get out of it. Yeah, it's unclear.
I would avoid the phrase uncanny valley for exactly the reasons that Emily mentioned, but I mean, in virtual reality, there's a lot of very interesting work on what makes a compelling virtual environment. And one of the things that seems to matter is people are perfectly happy with sort of cartoonish behavior or unrealistic behavior, but only if there's a corresponding lack of graphical realism. Which is to sort of say, if you're interacting in an environment with sort of like boxy objects and things, it's okay if the mechanics and dynamics and things are.
I don't really have anything much to add, except to perhaps say that it's something similar, I suspect, to what's already been said happens in other sort of art forms. So if you think about novels, some stories can be uncanny, and quite often those aren't the very fantastical ones, which would be analogous to the Styx puppets, but rather the ones that are very much like real life, except there's something is terribly wrong. You don't know exactly what it is, right? And the more extreme realism you get into the story, the more uncanny that becomes, because it makes it more like your actual life. So I suspect, although with puppets and robots and so on, it's arguably a perceptual phenomenon, I suspect it's a common thing across different art forms.
Oh, loads of questions. I'll speed up. Go on. I think I saw you first.
Just kind of relating to that, and it's just the difference between puppets and robots, and the. I personally, I love puppets. I'm a puppeteer, but I find robots quite creepy. But I wanted to ask more about the quality of movement and how we read emotion and the quality of movement differently with a puppet and with a robot. Because I suppose a robot's movement might often be engineered to really precisely mimic the mechanics of a specific movement, say picking up a cup or or taking a step. Whereas often in puppetry it's more about, like you were saying, distilling the essence, to find the essence of the movement or the essence of the feeling, and evoke a response in the audience that way. But I don't know much about how people watch robots and how people feel emotions when watching robots or read them. And I just thought
I can say a few things about that. It's a beautiful question, and I think the first thing I want to say is that roboticists should talk to puppeteers a lot more. You guys could teach roboticists a hell of a lot, because the problem with probably the last, not the problem, but a funny thing about maybe the last 25 years or so of robotics design, especially social robotics design, which is what I'm interested in, or not the design per se, but the implications of it, really trying to mimic human movement and biological motion. And boy, we're finding out now that that's pretty misguided, because just as you say, when you are manipulating a puppet, you don't have to find the exact biomechanics of the human movement. It's the essence of the movement. And this is just what our research has shown. This is what I have this 5-year project that I'm trying to kind of drill down into this point, which is it doesn't matter really how a robot moves. It can move in a really jerky way, but if you know that it's trying to comfort a person, or if you know that it's trying to signal, I need some help, it doesn't matter if it waves like this or if it waves like this. It's kind of what the intention is that's being signaled, and it's the extent to which a human interaction partner or a human perceiver is willing to kind of try to figure out what's going on. And in many ways, I think, and again, there's lots of robotics designers that just want to keep going more and more human-like, but I think we're finding that some of the most successful robots don't look like humans, don't move like humans, and something they don't act like humans, but they're able to perform certain behaviors that make it much easier for us to interact with, because they're not, you know, failing when trying to be too human-like. So I think, yeah, there should be much more crosstalk between these two disciplines, because you guys intuitively get this. This is what you work with. This is how you know to engage an audience. And I think roboticists it's a shortcut to understand how to make robots that are going to interact with humans more effective. Great. Yes.
Yeah, I was interested. We briefly skirted around the issue of sound, and in my own experience of working with puppets, there's a really strong relationship between them, and between the visuals and the sounds. I was wondering, talking to some of the experts here, the nearest I've come to seeing this slippage between one sense and another is an experiment called, I think it's to do with, it's called the misattribution of arousal, where one feeling will be attributed to another, and one will then logically go on to suppose something. But I make shows which deliberately take sound and people will remember it as what they've seen. And I was just wondering if there are any experiments or is there anything they could offer as further research in that area? It's kind of synesthesia that's going on. I think puppetry does it extraordinarily well.
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind for humans, what's the sounds? The McGurk effect. So there's a really nice study. Do you want to jump in? I don't do language processing, but there's a really nice study when you see certain movements of the mouth and you hear certain sounds. That sound you hear changes based on the movement you see. So if you close your eyes, you hear, I think, very clear ba or ha. And if you see the mouth, you hear a da. So, and it's very distinct, and it's a wonderful illusion because you can open and close your eyes and just walk back and forth between these two sounds, even though you know it's consistently the same sound. And it's one of the striking auditory illusions because the visual ones usually center of attention. So that would be the first line of research that comes to mind. I don't know whether people have other ones.
Well, I mean, there are more than dozens of studies that look at visual auditory interactions. I mean, there would be a whole field of psychology and cognitive neuroscience that looks at this. So hundreds of studies looking at multisensory interactions in general and auditory visual ones in particular. I think the McGurk effect is probably the ones that gets closest to the specific things that you're interested in. But there's quite a lot of work on this, that exploring the extent, what factors determine whether or not visual and auditory, frankly, inputs from any two modalities become bound. There are some general principles, so things that are judged as coming from the same spatial location are likely to be bound together compared to things that don't come from the same spatial location. Things that happen at the same time are likely to be bound together relative to things that happen at different times. And there are lots of studies exploring the boundary conditions of those things, lots of work that has explored the brain bases of these things. I think that's probably its.
But when you say you're interested in like the misattribution of arousal effect, or like kind of putting these things, are you talking about emotions here, or just kind of sight and sound? Are you trying to say?
Well, a whole lot, because you've got. I mean, if you're having, I mean, to use a word which has sort of come into question today, empathy. With a puppet, you're. I mean, my father was an opera singer, and he would get tired vocal cords from if he went to see other singers. So, and this you can hear this amongst a dancer set as well. Dancers will get tired legs. So the more familiar you are, if they're watching dancers, the more familiar you are with the activity that you're watching. Again, going back to the mirror neurons, you're not just having these micro movements. I mean, I played a lot of rugby in my youth. If I'm watching a rugby match, my legs are going like anything. So there is something which I then put into the way that I make puppets. So yeah, I'm looking at not only auditory and visual signals, but the kind of thing that you can get from empathy by confusing the empathy you're having with a puppet with maybe the way that you're mixing sound, because it seems to me that the brain actually puts things together, because it has to put things together in a hurry, because we're basically survival machines. We've learned, and we're now in a very different environment from the kind of things that were creating that survival need. It puts things together under pressure in often incredibly imperfect way, and you can exploit that extraordinarily in puppetry. So I was just looking for other angles. I mean, this seems to be sort of coming under the brackets of see me later for various. come and see me afterwards. But I would be very interested in any experiments between how one sense actually seems to substitute for another, which you think might be interesting to puppeteers.
Well, you have to have a scratch of your head. We have got a few other questions in the meantime. Sure.
Thanks. Yeah, so my question has to do with kind of mirror neurons and substitution. So when you had the skull and the brush, even though the puppet didn't have a body, and you mentioned, the panel kind of mentioned this, we imagined a body for the head and the brush. I kind of wonder just what's happening in the audience's mind when are we projecting the body in between these two? And then similarly, how much can the puppeteer take away and still allow the audience to imagine consciousness?
Well, those are two very big questions. On that point, we've been sort of saying, oh, well, you know, the puppeteer's body isn't part of the performance. Actually, in that particular moment where I was sitting, Mervyn's body actually was part of the body.
Sorry.
Partly because of the light behind, and yes, it was a silhouette, and it actually looked just like it was the body. Anyway, but that maybe not be quite what you were getting at.
I mean, I can answer some of the second half of that, and we alluded to this right at the beginning, that direction of gaze is of the eye line is so important in terms of, and such a fundamental thing in perception that that you read that, you know, I would say almost, as long as you know where the puppet's looking, you can infer its thoughts, you know, so if you know you're operating a puppet that's only got a head, you know that every thought and feeling has to be expressed somehow through the rhythm of where it's looking and the posture of the head, and you can get a lot across that way. And as soon as you get, you know, it depends what else you get. Sometimes you get just feet and a head, or just hand and a head, and then you start to see what you can put across. But almost nothing. I did do an experiment. You saw this, didn't you? We did an experiment in a workshop this year where we tried to get puppeteers. I wanted to get puppeteers to see if they could create a character without any puppet at all.
Oh, yes.
Because what their skill is, what I realised through doing this work, their skill is in imagining this imaginary character so in such detail that the audience can see it in an object, and I wondered if they could do it with no object. You can get a little bit. You can get a little bit. Once the invisible puppet starts to move, it's tricky for the audience. But you can certainly create, you know, in space, kind of an imaginary, you can draw the lines of an imaginary figure, you can give details about what they look like, and suddenly you'll find that the audience is really imagining a situation, a character, a relationship, and emotional content. And if that's what you know, that's most of the performance.
Just really one tiny point to add to that, and it comes back to the hydrogen symbol shapes, which we've talked about a lot, but I think you said, what's the minimal thing that you need for mind attribution? I think it's a point. It's a point. If you have a laser pointer, you could do a performance with a laser pointer. I think two-dimensionally you could have something as small as a point. That's not a puppet, I appreciate that, but I think it just shows you how small, how stripped down something can be in order for us to have mind attribution.
It's that movement too.
Yeah, movement. So this is the interesting point. Yeah. So,
that is, of course, the character of Tinkerbell in
Yeah.
Japan, 1903 or whatever that was. You know, so.
Yeah, without movement, this is a whole other interesting thing. This is where faces and other things become interesting, not necessary, but movement is
key.
Forgot the first half of the question.
Oh yeah, sorry, it was a two-part question, wasn't it?
Oh.
What's the minimum requirements?
I had forgot. Maybe I think that
We've all
performance
forgotten.
laid an egg in my head.
There's a mirror neuron thing about, do we imagine a body when there's no body there?
Yeah, what's happening? What's happening to the mind of the audience? What are they projecting the body? Are they just kind of filling in the gaps?
Well, I certainly didn't have a visual experience of the body, but there was a sort of feeling that there was a body there. So what you want to call that? Inference, an idea. I mean, there are some. There was a recent set of studies from the lab of Henrik Ersson in Stockholm, where they did something analogous to the rubber hand illusion. But what they did is they touched the subject's hand here, but then they took a paintbrush and they moved it just in empty space, like this. Not just in a straight line, but sort of as if it was tracing the contour of a hand with this light up and down sorts of movements in perfect temporal synchrony. And subjects report experiences more or less like the rubber hand illusion, but of ownership of an invisible hand. What exactly? It's not ownership of the space, but that there is some hand there which they just can't see. I haven't experienced this myself, but whether that's the sort of thing that's happening here, that there's this sense that there's a body there that you just can't see, it may not be any different from a body that's included. I mean, suppose you were just seeing the visible parts, so I guess it was the head and the hand, behind a board or any sort of opaque object, we wouldn't have any particular problem. And it gets out of a distinction that perceptual psychologists have made going back to the Gestalt psychologist Kafka and Wertheimer between two types of perceptual completion. So perceptual completion is basically this filling in process that we've alluded to a lot. And on the one hand, if you see my arm behind my head, of course you don't perceive my hand as sort of disconnected from my elbow because you can't see the bit that's behind my head. There's a sense in which you perceive the arm is completed behind the head. But on the other hand, you don't have any subjective experience of seeing that bit of the arm. And so that's what the Gestalt psychologists called amodal completion, and they contrasted it to other cases such as perceptual filling in of the blind spot or subjective contours. If those don't mean anything to you, I could draw it on a piece of paper later. But cases where there's filling in, the brain is clearly filling in stuff that isn't there, but you actually have a subjective experience of seeing the thing that's being filled in, and that's what they call modal completion. So in this case, I think there is perceptual completion of the body, but it seems to me that it's amodal and not modal, to use that technical distinction. But maybe other people have different experiences.
Actually, I might have to interrupt at this point because someone took away my big red clock and I've just looked over at Joel's clock and realised it's 5:30. I'm so sorry. I know there was an outstanding question from you, and I think there may have been a couple more. So if you're amenable and if you don't have to rush off, then do stick around, have another glass of wine and a quick chat. I think we get kicked out at 6 o'clock.
Yeah, but we can go on to the pub. So.
Pub activities also planned. I just want to say thank you so much to all of you for making this trip down today, and Mervyn for bringing everyone together and suggesting the format. Well, I know one of them disappeared, but the puppeteers did such a beautiful job. For me, it's been an absolutely fascinating afternoon. This is not really an area I work on, but it's stimulated all kinds of thoughts. So thank you ever so much, and thank you also for coming and for your great questions.
Thank you.